Welcome to episode 12 of An Understanding. This episode will be about Zachary Taylor. If you like it, listen. If you don't, eat biscuits. Enjoy. This is going to be a very dumbed down version of the Battle of Buena Vista because there's too many things that go along with it that coincide with this particular war itself. But anyways, let's begin. February 22nd of 1847, General Zachary Taylor looks on from his holding in his area in the town of Saltillo, Mexico. You see, you have to understand, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, some people call him the Mexican small Napoleon, I guess you could say, the Mexican Napoleon, has quickly resumed control of the Mexican army. He is the main leader that is the opposition force within the Mexican territory at this particular point in time. And General Zachary Taylor has lost his commission of leading the entirety of the Union Army, the United States military. That has been placed with General Winfield Scott, who is the commander of all U.S. forces in Mexico. General Winfield Scott actually tells Taylor to stay in Saltillo after the Battle of Monterrey to basically fortify and defend the place. And I guess you could say Winfield Scott, I can't think of his name for the life of me, sends word through letter to General Worth's troops that are also in Saltillo to come join him with the other divisions that are about to attack the city of Veracruz and the port of Veracruz itself. Santa Anna gets word of this. He actually intercepts the letter and realizes that Saltillo is going to be a very underly protected town that they could retake and destroy a large contingent of forces. Santa Anna makes his way towards Saltillo, capturing several contingencies of, small groups of Union soldiers that really bolsters Mexican support and Mexican enthusiasm for the actual war effort itself. Taylor gets word of this. He gets word that Santa Anna and his large force of 20,000 strong against Taylor's roughly 6,000 plus men, nearly tripling Taylor's men, gets word that they're on the warpath. He prepares his men, and for about a full week, he prepares defensive structures and defensive capabilities in the actual town of Saltillo, gets every single piece of artillery that he can, and gets everyone ready. He knows that this battle is going to be a very fierce one. He knows that this battle is going to be a very dominating battle. But what Taylor has is intelligence, capability, and what Taylor has above all else is the fundamental support, love, and admiration of every single one of his troops, without a hesitation. The Battle of Buena Vista is a very fierce battle. Very, very fierce. Santa Anna's troops attempts to basically flank into the actual area of Buena Vista and trying to get to the town in every single facet that they can. Cavalry troops, Minutemen troops, whatever you want to call them, while General Taylor has actually just bombarding these men with artillery, fierce gunfire, with better munitions. You gotta understand, Hispanic and Mexican munitions were not very good, especially for cannon fire. They were of poor quality and poor capability in comparison to United States munitions and gunpowder and whatnot, Despite us being a much smaller force, we are easily able to repel every single advance and attack that they come across. It's not an easy battle. Many men who would actually be a part of the war, in the Civil War, effectively. Notably, a man named Jefferson Davis is leading, cavalry charges, and along with Charles A. May's dragoons on Saltillo garrisons. This is a very long battle. Goes into the night. Then by the next morning, 9 a.m. of February 23rd, United States, despite being attacked on every single front that they can against the large contingent forces, as a Star Wars enthusiast would say, they have the high ground the next morning. So that by daylight, Americans, they go on the force. They go into force. Several different contingencies and different groups of Indiana soldiers, Illinois soldiers, they basically go in support and attack the Hispanics and the Mexicans. Santa Anna's forces are in a bit of disarray. They're destroyed. In a lot of instances, many dying. By the end of this incredibly fierce battle, which is very complicated to actually really go into, to be quite honest with you, but it's a very long and very specific battle. Santa Anna would lose upwards of 2,000 Mexican soldiers and be forced to retreat. And despite Zachary Taylor having the capabilities of going onto the actual offensive and chase while they're all reeling, Zachary Taylor realizes that he has 600 men that have died and many more that are injured. Himself even getting a bit of a scratch, barely a bullet missing him. He lacked vital equipment, transportation, but one factor General Taylor could always count on above all else was the loyalty, support, and admiration of his men. He looks like a farmer, one of his soldiers say, farmer in a market, jovial and good nature. He was no West Point spit and polish, but an officer with experience, tough, and above all else, reliable. His men liked him, were fiercely loyal. They would follow him through the gates of hell. One man in particular that would be a part of his entire, or at least a majority of his regiment itself, was a man named Ulysses S. Grant. He would say he was an officer. He was not an officer to trouble the administration much with demands, but was inclined to do the best that he could with the means given to him. He felt as if it was his responsibility to go no further. He was a good man. Zachary Taylor, along with many other battles subsequently, would solidify the nickname Old Rough and Ready. The Battle of Buena Vista was a severe defeat for Santa Anna. Ego, men, and loss, and a severe gain for Zachary Taylor. Not as a war hero, not as a general, but eventually as a president. Zachary Taylor is this country's 12th president, and a very fascinating one when you really look into it. You know, he's a very fascinating man because the more you learn about him, the more you tend to admire him and also feel very conflicted about him in many different ways. He's really a part of this country's history in a lot of the underknown parts of the big events in this country's history, notably with like the War of 1812, a lot of the Native Wars, etc., and obviously with the Mexican-American War, which he actually has less influence on than I think I wanted to realize, because he's really just in it for the beginning of it, but for the most part, really just does that for the most part. You know, he's our 12th president of the United States of America, and probably the first one in this country's history that, he has no political experience whatsoever. And when I mean no political experience, really whatsoever, I don't think, at least William Henry Harrison was a territorial governor of Indiana before he became president of the United States of America. Zachary Taylor was just a military man through and through throughout his entire life. But who is Zachary Taylor? Because I don't think anyone really knows who Zachary Taylor is. He's this weird, if I'm going to be 100% honest with you, other than his own vice president, I don't think a lot of people really recognize Zachary Taylor or really know who he is in a lot of ways. Because at the very least, people know who Franklin Pierce is or Buchanan, because they're always on the list for like the worst presidents of all time, for good reason, in fairness. But Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, who the fuck are these motherfuckers? We don't really know. And I'll tell you, Zachary Taylor is probably one of the most fascinating war heroes and military generals this country's ever seen. One that has participated in a numerous amount of wars, and one that has had a very unique upbringing in comparison to a lot of other people in this country. Zachary Taylor is complicated as well. He's a slave owner, but he's also one of the most financially competent individuals that we've ever had in this country's history, and specifically as the President of the United States of America. And above all else, has a fascinating relationship with many natives and Indians, etc., and one that I think really embodies what a lot of people probably felt about natives. And, if you want to really understand how a lot of settlers felt about natives, it's probably look no further than, I think, Zachary Taylor, which is basically like look, I'm going to look at you empathetically and sympathetically, but this is my land. I'm going to do what I got to do, and I'm going to do my duty. This is, you call it manifest destiny, whatever you want to call it, but this is what it is. Zachary Taylor is president, despite it being a very shortened term. He would actually be the second president in this country's history to die in office. Notably as well, think if I'm correct, the third shortest term in office, behind William Henry Harrison and James A. Garfield, I believe, the Republican president, years down the road. And one that leads, basically, in a lot of ways, becomes the ultimate president that really fucks over the Whigs in a lot of ways. I mean, this basically just solidifies the Whigs as a failure as a political party, unfortunately, because basically they're just saying, you can't keep putting all these war heroes in because they're all just going to keep fucking dying, so y'all just got to stop. Just stop. And really, in a lot of ways, Zachary Taylor is the president that kind of destroys the Whigs and creates the Republican Party that would eventually, basically, whatever your opinion is of the Republican Party, but, really save this country and save this union for the most part. And it's unfortunate because Zachary Taylor, I think, is a fascinating individual, and I'm curious to see what his presidency would have been, because he oversees a very difficult point of time within this country's history, notably with the Compromise of 1850 that's going to be going around, and the eventual sectional crisis that occurs right after James K. Polk gets all the land known to man, basically the entire western hemisphere of this country, for the most part. He's not the most consequential president or one that, the history books are going to be writing, immense biographies about. And in fact, me trying to find a bunch of biographies about, Zachary Taylor was a little bit complicated trying to find even a couple. So my information might not be the greatest information. It'll probably be, specific bare bones stuff in relative comparison to some of the other ones that I've done. But for the most part, Zachary Taylor is a very fascinating historical figure, and we should get started. Zachary Taylor would be born on November 24th, 1784, in Orange County, Virginia. Notably, he's cousins with a shit ton of people. Everyone just fucking knows everyone, fucks everyone, I guess, He's second cousins, for instance, to James Madison. He's third cousins to Robert E. Lee, and in particular, his family is one of the most prominent families, the Taylor family, within the region itself. They wouldn't be like the Lees, the Robert E. Lees, or the Carters, I guess you could say, or, the Madisons by any stretch of the imagination, but they're still a very prominent family, and one that would be considered upper class in every sense of the word, And his father was Richard Taylor, very good father, and one who served in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. I think he was a lieutenant or something like that. And again, being one of the heads of the prominent families, which ironically resulted, along with during the Revolutionary War period, to be in good faith for Richard Taylor, because they basically, with the Articles of Confederation, had actually, for some particular reason, granted Richard Taylor a large parcel of land near what is now today Louisville, Kentucky. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why, because Richard, why he accepted, because, he had a large plantation, again, being an upperclassman kind of family. The family itself was slowly struggling due to the fact that the tobacco returns within their fields weren't yielding the same level, for the most part, as they were before. The soil was being raised and wasted out, and the soil needed some time to recuperate, unfortunately, so he decided, let's just move the entire family to Kentucky, and become this really prominent family westward, and basically he was going to double the size of his land for the most part. I think he was going to go up to 400 plus acres at that point and get a lot more slaves there. So he initially went on his own. His wife was pregnant in 1785. There's a whole bunch. Zachary Taylor, I think, had 7 siblings as he was growing up. He was specifically the third of many surviving sons. No, he had 8 siblings, I believe, technically speaking. 7 that would survive effectively into adulthood, I believe, but I'm not sure at this particular point in time. I know he was a third, and he had one brother, I believe, that had died in infancy, and 3 younger sisters on top of that as well. But anyways, his father goes west to Kentucky, mainly because just by himself, because the family couldn't go. The wife was pregnant. She could not make the trip. It was a very difficult and arduous journey that they would have to go to. So he goes there. He settles up in a log cabin for the most part before he ends up creating his brick house on the plantation that would be known as Springfield Plantation. So Zachary Taylor goes along with his 2 older brothers and another brother in the very first 8 months of his life. You know, I mean, he may have been born a Virginian, but he's not a Virginian, if that makes any sense. So once his family moved out to what is now Louisville, Kentucky, things were pretty interesting for young Zachary Taylor as he effectively ends up growing in the big frontier life, you know. He would deal with everything that, you know, the frontiersmen would have to deal with, notably some Native American Indian attacks that Zachary Taylor loved those stories, you know, and especially the aura of his, he idolized his father, especially his father's service in the Revolution specifically, and the skirmishes with some of the natives, and just the fighting spirit, you know, was really embedded into Zachary Taylor at a very, very young age, war, etc., and the idealization of his father really pushed him into a bit of a military life. But for the most part, you know, when he's there, he has all his siblings there. I fully believe about 7 of them that would survive into adulthood. 4 brothers and 3 sisters. Zachary Taylor would have a bit of a fascinating upbringing in frontiers, education and lifestyle. You know, just like a normal frontier kid. For the most part, especially before the family moved the entire family into the actual brick house plantation that he would live for the majority of his early life. He loved his mother. His mother was a very doting mother, but for the most part, really just kind of let the father take over for a lot of the stuff. And they were both highly educated parents, very highly educated and upper class, but ironically, aside from, you know, the reading and writing, Zachary Taylor, by all accounts, aside from some tutoring, wasn't the most well-educated individual and person ever, to be brutally honest with you. Most of his education really came from learning the frontier life, farming, swimming, etc., how to survive Native American attacks, because there was always a constant fear, especially in the frontier area, especially of Kentucky, Tennessee, around those particular areas. Because remember, this is, you know, at this particular point, it's like the mid 1790s, the early 1800s, that, you know, there's a bunch of fear there. There's one story in particular that he actually got to see some of his neighbors. One lady had actually had some baldness on her head, and, you know, being frontier is probably really fascinating because it's a lot of humor there, despite some horrors and atrocities. But one of his neighbors actually had part of her head part of her head scalped and removed some headgear and displayed a bald head, and was basically described as, like, you know, peeling an onion by the Indian scalping knife. And, you know, whether the story's true or not, at least in terms of some of the biographies I read, it depends. But for the most part, you know, Zachary Taylor loved those stories. He loved the fascination. You know, I think he was just always a deeply fascinated young lad in terms of just war, combats, the ferocity of man versus man, macho and macho, you know. And in a lot of ways, I think kind of like a bit of an early strenuous life, at least in the early going, for young Zachary Taylor. You know, he always physically competed with himself. He learned a lot of business techniques early on, growing up, even despite the dangerous atmosphere of the Native American attacks, on how to be a good farmer and how to be a good businessman. His parents really pushed that into him. And really emphasize, you know, more shrewd, logical stuff than the whole philosophical nature of, I guess you could say, a liberal arts kind of education, even in that particular point in time. Native attacks were very, very common for everyone that was in the frontier's life. And, and many of these, future presidents who would go out into the frontier were not, immune to native attacks. There's actually one story in particular, when I think Zachary Taylor was about 5 years old, that he had, along with a big party of kids, were all playing around. They were actually attacked by savages, I guess you could say. At least that's what the description was, near Goose Creek, around Louisville. And basically, this guy who was a friend of the family's, Thomas Cleveland, or his father, Abraham Cleveland, and along with his friend Thomas Cleveland, actually had left. They escaped by boat and arrived at a small cabin that wasn't very, very big at all. They were, I think it was maybe 12 feet by 12 feet kind of thing going on. Or 14 feet by 14. It's a small cabin. I'm probably overemphasizing how small it is, but at that point, Richard Taylor, his father, would go out, try and hunt these Indians, and it was a very suspenseful, roughly about 6 weeks or so for Zachary Taylor, when he actually also grew close to his father, etc., etc. And, it was a bloody massacre for a lot of the people, unfortunately, around that particular point in time. And, it only held more resolve of the frustrations that Zachary Taylor would have with natives, although he would understand their plight fundamentally throughout his entire life, when he would eventually go to war with them years later on. And it's deeply fascinating, too, for young Zachary Taylor, because, like I said, he, growing up, learning to be a farmer, learning to be all that stuff, and every single opportunity he would get to try and learn the school, Zachary Taylor would have some issues with it. I think a lot of things are coinciding with a whole bunch of things, but in terms of his, relatively speaking, the entire family, he's not the most astute student of all. He's not a very good student. His handwriting was always very porous. His writing in general was always, pretty just bad in general. And it doesn't help that his education was always incredibly sporadic, especially during what are supposed to be the very formative years of one's particular education. So, just a generalization, growing up for young Zachary Taylor was basically, I'm going to be a farmer and a soldier in a lot of ways, or at least the many things that were leading him down that path, And, he would enjoy his life and enjoy the life of a frontiersman, During the more formative years of his life, Thomas Jefferson becomes president, and it's a very tumultuous time because he wants to join the military, but, it's around that particular time the Embargo Act's occurring, etc., etc. Tensions are rising for British and America, and, his family's a little bit apprehensive of him joining the military eventually, but, so for some time, Zachary Taylor tries to make it out on his own. From 14 to 18, he really just learns the game of planting, etc., etc., crop yields, tobacco and corn being his go-to for the most part, and he really understands agriculture and agricultural subjects. And he was also trying to accomplish this weird act of nature speculation, I guess you could say, and land speculation, and how to make money, and also wanting to really enjoy military life in some meaningful way. He would go to school and whenever he possibly could, because he later attended a school operated by this lady named Alicia Ayer, who'd be one of the big tutors, and also the Middletown, Kentucky Academy as well, to basically be originally a classically trained soldier, and really learned how to actually operate some guns, etc., etc., and also really learn fundamentally the basic grasp of spelling and grammar. Like I said before, his handwriting was poor, and he wasn't educated as properly as he probably could have and should have around this particular point in time. And it was a very difficult point because his handwriting was very crude, and he just wanted a military life in a lot of meaningful ways. But he also understood he had to learn how to be sufficient on his own, because being a part of the military isn't going to be the thing that's going to help you. No one should have just a military career, ultimately, is what was beaten to his head in many ways. Zachary Taylor, though, really also was one that enjoyed life. in many ways. There's actually one story of him swimming across the entire Ohio River at a very young age when he's like 16, 17 years old, and, really worked hard. He was a very hardworking kid, and I think he was just like a lot of these young presidents and a lot of these young people who are growing up that are trying to figure out what the hell they're going to do with this life. And for Zachary Taylor, he actually had the opportunity to do a lot of the things that he wanted to do. And I think that was a bit of a problem because he wanted to be a military man, he wanted to make money as a farmer, etc., etc. And, it was just really difficult to make decisions and choices, ultimately, for the most part of the early portion of his life. Zachary Taylor did grow up, though. He really got the opportunity to see, Louisville really grow up into a really prominent town. It went from being log cabins to eventually clay cabins and then brick house cabins, and then, next thing you know, a church is built. And he really sees a lot of this happening. He really gets to see what the frontier life and a city really becoming a city in Louisville. And he really gets to see how a lot of things are really occurring over this particular point in time. And his family's so prominent in this area too, not just being from the Virginians, etc., etc. But the Taylors, his father is still a very prominent individual who had fought in the Revolutionary War. I believe he might have actually been in the Battle of Brandywine at one point, and was someone who had prominence, was effectively becoming one of the first justices of the peace, etc., etc., and really had a lot of leeway, etc., etc. And his son gets to see it all, and he gets to really enjoy it, participating in a lot of the pleasures, I guess you could say, of the place, a lot of eating, whiskey drinking, dancing, scandalous stuff back then. And, Zachary Taylor really liked a lot of what society was really, there for, And despite, being a little bit older and not being the most educated person, he basically just stayed on the farm to help the growing plantation, especially for Richard Taylor, his father, and the mother, whom he truly, truly loved and was very deeply close with on an emotional level. Deeply loved his mother, but he was basically stayed on to help his father with the farm. I mean, I'm talking about hundreds and hundreds of acres and acres of land, prominence, etc., etc. It was a very financially lucrative point, for Zachary Taylor and the family, even despite the severe economic drop-off with the Embargo Act of 1806, and they were still very prominent, very strong, I guess you could say financially competent family. His father really taught young Zachary and his older brothers, diversify your bones, son, little things like that. Excuse me, I'm a little bit gassy. Anyways, Zachary Taylor really enjoyed his life in Louisville, but he really longed for more. Let's just be honest. You get sedentary in a particular lifestyle, and you have the golden years of your life ahead of you. And for a couple years he does this once he really reaches, I guess you could say, mature age. And I'm sorry if I'm kind of pushing forward through his youth in a little bit, because I feel like I'm going a little bit fast with his youth, but he just has a normal frontier upbringing in life. And in his early 20s, he really contemplates maybe trying out a military career. And military careers were often very difficult. His older brother actually joined the military much earlier. William, he was a lieutenant in the artillery, and really didn't have any upbringing. He couldn't go up or higher within the actual army itself. And for Zachary Taylor, for him to think about joining the army, he kind of waited a little bit. I think he picked his particular point in time. I think if he was going to join the military, he wanted to join when there's maybe some new regiments joining. Maybe the Congress can actually open up some, hey, can you commission 75,000 more soldiers, etc., etc., which would mean more ranks, more ability for upbringing, stuff like. He's a pretty smart cat, in fairness, to be quite honest with you, and also wanted to wait for a war to potentially happen. So in 1808, Zachary Taylor decides he's going to take the leap. He's going to make the big jump himself and actually join the military. He's going to join the military for two reasons. One, the tensions with the British, but ultimately also tensions with the Spanish in particular. So just to give a brief summary of the beginning, start, I guess you could say, of Zachary Taylor's military career. first and foremost, he actually joins the Kentucky militia in 1806. Before he actually joins the military, he rises through the ranks and then joins the actual federal military, United States Army, in 1808. For a lot of reasons. I totally forgot about it, but I think his older brother ends up dying to the natives, or getting killed by the natives the year before, and that's partly the reason. Maybe get back at the natives for killing my brother, and the British, and obviously Spanish tensions, wars rising and abound potentially. Doesn't hurt either that James Madison is your cousin, who is the Secretary of State and basically going to be the president next year, so it doesn't hurt that at all. And when he comes in, he's initially a lieutenant, and in order to get men, recruiting back then was very different. I probably briefly touched on it with William Henry Harrison, but even then, for years down the road, there's no recruiting station or depot, so you're basically just going from place to place, being like, hey, you want to join the army? You want to fight for your country, etc., etc. And again, at this particular point in time, the Second War of Independence hasn't really occurred, and there's not the greatest amount of level of patriotism in comparison, I guess you could say, to what life would be like during the Mexican-American War. But for the most part, Zachary Taylor would just go from place to place. Just a brief overview. He goes from various parts of Kentucky, goes to Memphis, Tennessee, Natchez, Mississippi. He travels all around basically in the southeast portion of the country to really try and get as many troops as he possibly could to fill his regiment. His regiment's really, on paper, really nothing, so he has to actually recruit his own men, at least in the early going for the most part. And then I'll get into the actual specifics and stuff of everything that happens. But a lot really happens, and a lot doesn't happen during this particular point in time, because he really doesn't like being a recruiter. Obviously when you join the military, you're kind of like, let's go fight and rumble and tumble, and for him to basically go from place to place to just try and recruit men, and I think he was only getting $30 a month or something like that, or I forgot how his actual price, unfortunately, but it was a little bit difficult for him financially too, So for Zachary Taylor in recruiting, he's first sent to Washington, basically said, try and recruit there. He doesn't like it. It's like a weird mixture of citizen life and military life, and, it doesn't go particularly well initially for Zachary Taylor. And sorry if I'm going all over the place with his military career for the most part. It's very sporadic, and I've read 2 different books so far that tell me 2 different things completely. But for the most part, and generally speaking, the path is very clear. He's just basically going from place to place to recruiting as many men as he humanly can, going from places like Fort Pickering, Memphis, Tennessee, Mississippi, just so that he can gain as many men as he possibly could. And by the time he gets about, in his regiment in particular, about 80 to 90 men, he ends up going down, specifically after recruiting them and bringing them to Kentucky. They all go down to Mississippi to New Orleans. New Orleans is a very complicated place. In 1809 is when he actually, and he and his men, early April 1809, is a very complicated place and a very complicated situation. New Orleans around this particular point in time, the weather's not very conducive. A lot of... I'll get to it in just a second, but a lot more men died just from, the illnesses, the dysentery, the diarrhea, etc., and just poor health in a lot of ways from the very rough and tumble heat of New Orleans summer. And I think a lot of people would record during that time, it's probably the hottest summer in 20 years, probably. Anyways, by the time he gets there, he's initially under the command of General James Wilkinson, who a lot of people in history do not like. Notably, Andrew Jackson despises this man, and I'll tell you why in just a little bit. But he's under the command of General James Wilkinson. Wilkinson is a very complicated figure. A lot of people don't like him, and in history has kind of looked down upon him. But it's one of those histories where it's like, I understand why history really looks down upon him. General James Wilkinson, I guess you could say he's kind of like the de facto governor leader in a lot of ways to New Orleans, at the very least the American regiment, and specifically. And when in New Orleans, he probably, along with Zachary Taylor's men, probably has upwards of about 2,000 troops in his command, a large contingent force to protect the properties of the United States, etc., and also the rivers that go down, Mississippi River, etc. And these were not opportune conditions. This in the specific area that he was at. In fact, he's actually asked to move his troops to Natchez, Mississippi, or at least the fort there. Much more opportune physical weather, less mosquitoes, little things like that. For whatever reason, he doesn't go there. He actually takes his troops to a town that is much, much farther away. And I'm going to be 100% honest with you. The more you look at Wilkinson, it's hard to justify him being a good man. A lot of people would describe him as villainous, treacherous, etc., etc. I mean, the whole reason why he ended up going to one of the towns and disobeying orders in a lot of ways really was because of financial money. Not to mention, apparently his mistress was there. So yeah, it is what it is, unfortunately. Pussy. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, just like, it controls man, I'm telling you. And unfortunately, it ended up costing about more than half his army, literally just from sickness and in heat. Because you have to understand, and specifically a lot of Zachary Taylor's men too succumb to just weather. They go from like one of the coldest winters to one of the hottest summers, and they just get sick. Everyone gets sick, loses a lot of his men. Zachary Taylor himself gets very sick and almost succumbs to the illness, but he ends up surviving it. And then obviously Wilkinson's kind of just like, what? Why are all my people dying? And Taylor's like, dude, fuck you. And then Zachary Taylor ends up going home, takes an extended leave, I guess you could say, and goes home. He goes back home to basically Louisville, and he rekindles a relationship. I should have probably talked about before, but before he goes to New Orleans, he actually meets what would be his future wife, Margaret Smith, who's basically like, hey, what's up, girl? How you doing? I'm a part of the military. You like that? She's like, ooh, I do like that. Anyways, they keep some relative correspondence, and then, then when he comes back, he's like, Margaret, I cannot live without you. I almost died. This motherfucker, James Wilkinson, trying to get some pussy. He trying to kill all his men. Ugh. And she's like, I want to marry you now. So when he comes back, he ends up taking an extended vacation and leave in Louisville, as he marries Margaret Mackle Smith. She's actually, it's kind of funny. Margaret is actually just visiting her sister. She's like, oh, Zachary, you're home. And then it's just like, oh, yeah, I almost died. I can't live without you. Do you want to come get hitched with me? She's like, oh, let's do it. So they literally get married like the moment he comes back, like 3 days later or something like that. I'm telling you, people were wild back then. But anyways, his father, Richard Taylor, basically just like, here, son, I'll give you 300 acres of land since you need to basically be able to take care of your family. So Zachary Taylor takes some time, gets things situated before he goes back into his military career. Margaret Taylor, or Margaret Mackle Smith, whatever you want to call her, but Zachary Taylor's wife, eventual 12th First Lady, is a very fascinating young woman. She because her entire family is like this prominent family of planters. She's very well educated, and she is just deeply fascinating, as an amalgamation, to be honest with you. The relationship with Zachary is really good, to be quite honest with you. I would probably say, obviously it's not the greatest relationship, but for the most part, deeply loving, compassionate, very happy. I mean, the only big issues I would probably say is just Zachary Taylor being in combat and war made her constantly worry. I'm pretty sure there's some like letters, and people kind of just come to the conclusion that she basically gave up all of life's worldly pleasures if Zachary Taylor would come home safely from war, etc., etc. And it kind of made her a recluse in retrospect, and also especially when she was in the White House too as the first lady. A lot of it went to her youngest daughter, Mary Elizabeth, who actually ended up becoming like technically the first lady hostess. Well, that too, and just health in general. She had 6 kids, but she had 6 kids always. Because she usually joined Zachary wherever he ended up going, and it was physically a difficult, having 6 kids while on the road, kind of situation, instead of being, placed in a more opportune area, I guess you could say. But by all accounts, they had a really good relationship. Just to go and explain it, they had 6 kids. 2 of them would die very young. One would die in infancy, and one would die in early childhood. 3 of them would live to be pretty old, for the most part. Another one, Sarah Knox Taylor, little tidbit, married a young eventual colonel in the Mexican-American War named Jefferson Davis, who, by all accounts, Zachary Taylor was not all for, so I just want to point that out. I think it's really fascinating. But, Zachary Taylor and Jefferson Davis, technically speaking, 2 presidents. One for the Confederacy, obviously, and then one for the United States Union. It's fascinating how history works and how people work. It's a very small country, you know what I'm saying, fam? But anyways, the relationship is really good. When Zachary Taylor dies, she would end up dying a couple years later. Her health would deteriorate, and despite that, a very okay relationship, a very solid relationship. And after they had their honeymoon, which it's not very clear where they went, but it's very clear that they got it on. And soon after their honeymoon, their first child was born, Anne Mackle Taylor. So from, I guess you could say, summer of 1810 to the next summer of 1811, Zachary Taylor really has a fascinating opportunity. A lot of things are happening. British tensions for the time being aren't really extreme, I guess you could say, other than some native attacks that are very sporadic. It's relatively peaceful in America. And for Zachary Taylor, especially since his first daughter was born, his first kid, it's a real opportunity for him to get his finances in order. For the most part, due to the fact that being a soldier isn't a very lucrative career, unfortunately. Zachary Taylor ultimately ends up using the land accumulated from his father. It really starts being a very fantastic planter. It really diversifies his plant yield. The one thing about Zachary Taylor, which is the complete opposite of William Henry Harrison, is that he was a very financially sound person. Really got his shit together. Was a very hardworking man, a very diligent man, a very principled man, and was a very reliable man, I think, is how I would probably put Zachary Taylor. And he was really fucking good. He's the kind of guy that's like, diversify your bonds, son. I mean, he actually had invested in a whole bunch of different companies, a couple of different banks. I mean, I think by 1850, the actual value of his plantation was probably close to $7 million. I mean, that's incredible. That is fantastic for him. In the early goings, it was actually looking really promising. I don't know if he actually had slaves at this particular point in time, but I'm not going to be shocked if he didn't. Or did or didn't. But he would be a slave owner too, unfortunately, for throughout his entire life. But, like I said before, with the rising tensions, and it's kind of fascinating, because a lot of the stuff with William Henry Harrison kind of comes with Zachary Taylor too. And the Northwestern Territories, the Indiana Territory, is in a bit of a state of flux. And he ends up being commissioned to go back into the military service and actually go to the Indiana Territory and deal with a whole bunch of different things there. He's going from fort to fort. In that particular area, his wife kind of stays behind because, babies, at least for the time being, and potential danger. So first he goes to Fort Knox, for instance, leading his men there. Because I think the actual commander had left. He's like, fuck this shit. And he goes from fort to fort to try and basically stabilize a whole bunch of different situations, straighten out a whole bunch of different people, and a lot of it's funny because a lot of people there started kind of being like, damn, this guy's pretty cool, Captain Taylor, because I forgot he is a captain now at this particular point in time. He's been promoted, and he's really one of the leaders there. He assumes command of Fort Knox. it's funny too, because he's there to help protect the people from the Indians, natives, and you have to understand, it's not like there's hundreds of thousands of soldiers at each fort. No, there's only 20 or so that are garrisoned at each fort. So he has to go from fort to fort, make sure they're all Gucci, and make sure they're all capable, well supplied, well trained, etc., etc. And this would be his job, at least for the time being. I should also note too that he actually ends up being forced to go to Washington for a month or so. James Wilkinson actually gets court-martialed, and he has to actually talk to a whole bunch of different people. He'd be interviewed. He's like, yeah, this guy's kind of a shitty dude, Taylor did not really like Wilkinson at all, to be quite honest with you. There's actually a bit of a reason why, too, that you don't hear Zachary Taylor in the Battle of Tippecanoe. So Wilkinson ends up getting acquitted, by the way. He had a lot of friends in high places. It wasn't a very conducive experience. The whole entire court thing was a bit of a pointless issue for Zachary Taylor to be a part of. And he ended up missing the Battle of Tippecanoe, which, Tippecanoe was a bit of a tipping point, I guess you could say, for a lot of the war that would eventually ignite a lot of the tensions in the War of 1812. But for the most part, Taylor kind of regretted missing that battle, just because, it's war. He hadn't really done anything, for the most part. So he's really just vibing, doing a whole bunch of different things. And he wanted to really make a name for himself and never really got that opportunity in the early goings of the War of 1812. But, for him, when he does return, he starts seeing a lot of shit happen. The War of 1812 was really upon them. The Battle of Tippecanoe made Tecumseh really, really fierce and was like, oh, fuck you guys. So he's just going apeshit on everybody. And, tensions keep rising. He sees a lot more troops kind of be getting garrisoned at different forts, etc., etc. He realizes war is going to be upon them. And that, it's pretty cool, too, for Zachary Taylor. William Henry Harrison's his homeboy, his home skillet, and really develops a pretty strong relationship, I would probably say. And I think William Henry Harrison has a bit of an admiration for Zachary Taylor. A little bit vice versa, too, because William Henry Harrison, Tippecanoe, yada, yada, yada. But eventually what I'm trying to say is war is coming. And the War of 1812 officially comes, obviously, in 1812. And Zachary Taylor is going to be right in the thick of it in the Northwestern Territory to begin with. The War of 1812 for Zachary Taylor begins pretty early, to be quite honest with you. He, in the very beginning, is actually one to lead a large contingent and group of men, actually even before the declaration of war. He gets word as he's traveling from fort to fort, etc., that Fort Harrison, one of the more important forts in the Northwestern Territory. Because you have to understand, there's several forts that are very important in this war itself. Fort Harrison, one in particular that is going to be necessary for protection of, the white man and the settlers, yada yada, and that fort's main purpose is to protect the farmers from the natives and native attacks, etc., and that one is the key area specifically that's close to Prophettown with Tecumseh's younger brother, and Tecumseh, like that's a very key point and key force that needs to be well protected and well defended. So Taylor gets a large contingent of men, some of them men along with their families, travel to Fort Harrison. It's a very, very long and very, very arduous journey. A lot of them get sick. A shit ton of them get sick. I'd say about a third of them end up dying on the way there, unfortunately. Some of them needing to be buried. By the time they get there, even Zachary Taylor himself gets sick. Keep in mind, Zachary Taylor is about 27 years old around this point in time. And by the time they get there, the force of maybe 70, 80 men that are garrisoned at Fort Harrison, I would probably say maybe 20 of them are actually healthy, not filled with what people call this bullious fever. Yeah. By the time they get there, it's very clear that the fort's a little bit in disarray. Everyone's like, And the natives have been kind of combing the area. They've been kind of scouting the place, but they're not actually doing anything whatsoever. So by the time he gets there, and despite the poor physical health, Zachary Taylor effectively ends up just really taking over. He's the de facto leader of the actual fort itself, and by the time September hits is when things start getting very, very interesting. So Zachary Taylor, he's at the fort, and that's when, for the next 24 hours, September 4th, I believe, might be the night, there's this native called Joseph Lemar. Zachary Taylor actually knew him, apparently. He was bearing this flag of truce, etc., etc. He goes to the fort. He's like, hey, y'all, you got some extra food in there? And Zachary Taylor's like, food? You know, he thinks this is really suspicious. So he tells him, get the fuck away from here. Go away. Which for Taylor, it actually ended up being pretty, but we're kind of like the right move. And basically there that night, all he hears, he wakes up to gunshots, and his sentries are targeting and fighting Indians, and basically they're trying to burn down the fort. So Zachary Taylor's like, oh shit, fam. And then he notices in particular they're trying to burn down like basically the food storage area, and he's like, oh shit, fam. So he goes over there, stops them, and basically repels one of the first Indian attacks. And a lot of people, after this particular attack, when he takes charge and does all the things, they're basically saying that fucking Zachary Taylor is OP. He was calm, he was cool, presence of mind, prudent, courageous. Every little thing that he could do was fucking OP. He was awesome. And then after this, he ends up being forced to send a couple messengers because he's just like, fam, I need help out here, okay? They're going to kill us. And then the governor of Indiana at the time, the acting governor, because William Henry Harrison's doing the war thing, John Gibson, sends and tells this guy, Colonel William Russell, who was actually Zachary Taylor's commanding officer before with the 7th Infantry. He's just like, all right, I got you, fam. Brings literally like 1,200 men, and they reach Fort Harrison along with a whole bunch of food subsidies. Because you understand, this was a very strategic attack by the natives. They burned everything down. They killed all the livestock, which is fucking brutal. Burnt most of the corn. So all the corn that they had was like really crappy corn that they could eat. It was a very not good time. But Zachary Taylor kind of gets, a lot of recognition. A lot of people say that Zachary Taylor is just this awesome person, and he gets a promotion to brevet major. I actually think that might have been the first brevet major. I don't even know what it is, but apparently it's kind of like just more of a ceremonial kind of award. There's no pay increase. It's just kind of like, cool, you get this, But, for Zachary Taylor, it was honorable. Because, he literally just repelled one of the most, I guess you could say arguably one of the more important Indian attacks at that particular time. That was a big battle, first and foremost. The fact that they were able to hold their position, because he's basically like, he's sneaking out messengers in the middle of the night to contact the governor and stuff. Like, they're on the fort, and this is a very strategic point that, Zachary Taylor really held strong for the most part. And you have to understand a lot of things that are happening too. This is when America is losing a shit ton of battles. Detroit, General Hull just gives up. He says, fuck it, it was a bit of a disgrace, etc., etc. And William Henry Harrison's basically leading the entire, Northwestern Territory, and he's doing his own thing. And especially for him, he goes to see, Zachary Taylor, and he's like, hey, you're a pretty strong lad. I'm going to be president one day. You're going to be president one day. And it's like, oh, cool. Anyways, I think it's kind of cool where two presidents are kind of like in the same fort, at the same fort with one another. Just little things like that I always find deeply, deeply fascinating when William Henry Harrison comes to visit him. So for the next year or so, I'm just going to kind of fast forward after William Henry Harrison's kind of like, what's up, fam? You did a good job there. And a whole bunch of different things happen. Zachary Taylor wants to fight. He wants to go fight, so he's asking to go to the Eastern Theater because there's a bunch of things bubbling up there that they're getting word of. But they're saying, you're not needed there, you're needed in the Northwestern Theater. And Zachary Taylor is kind of just like, just please, can I fight someone? Let me get in fisticuffs with somebody. And they don't allow that to happen. What they really need Zachary Taylor to do is recruit people, which he fucking hates. But he's got some street cred with them, so got some notoriety, positive notoriety, and a solid reputation. And they're basically like, we need men for the war, because right now our army's really small, and we're trying to recruit as many men as we possibly can for at least the summer of 1813. That's the aim. That's the goal. This war is probably going to be a little while, and we need to prepare, and we need to get ready, even though we're losing left and right. And Zachary Taylor's kind of like, I'll fight. I'll just do it for the country. So he does a lot of things. He goes to the Indiana and Illinois territory and tries to get as many men as he possibly could in those specific territories, recruiting, trying to get people to become officers, etc., etc. He's even talking with a whole bunch of different people about specific plans. He talks and joins with this guy, Colonel Russell, in basically trying to create, I guess you could say, fast marches, or just basically perfecting battle plans and battle ideas and different formations to effectively allow much more smaller, compact units so that they can move faster. Little things like that, because they're going to need to combat, the natives. And I mean, aside from probably William Henry Harrison, all that's debatable, Zachary Taylor knows the natives very well and how they fight. I mean, he grew up fighting them, or grew up with them in his entire life. So he effectively ends up basically just being like, okay, this is how we're going to do it. And he initially goes on some expeditions in middle of 1813. He goes back and forth between Indiana and Kentucky, and really goes home for a little bit in Louisville, where he's like, hey babe, how you doing? Boo? Want to come with me? And she's like, well, I'm not pregnant now, but I'll be pregnant in a little bit, so why not? So Taylor comes back home, and then basically moves his family into the area where Fort Knox is at this particular point in time. Basically, all of 1813, he doesn't do anything. He settles his family at Fort Knox, which he's overseeing, which has a small contingent of soldiers, about 50 men, and he's really just vibing. He's chilling, and he's a little bit disappointed because, around this particular point in time, he's hearing all these stories left and right about all these battles that are happening. William Henry Harrison, obviously, some of the things that are happening in northeast Maryland, especially a lot of the Navy battles too. Notably, James Lawrence, one of the many captains who basically has, one of the famous Navy slogans of all time that he ends up creating, says, "Don't give up the ship." Little things like that are happening around this particular point in time. And by 1814, he's kind of itching a little bit. He's just like, bruh, I've been waiting for a fucking long just imagine, maybe you're stuck at Fort Knox in a wooden fort with your family for 6 months. You've done nothing. It's just monotonous and relatively boring. Maybe you're farming a little bit, just training your troops on occasion, just watching and standing guard, and maybe send a patrol that. Maybe walk around outside the fort if you feel pretty ballsy. Little things like that. I mean, 6 months is a really long time, or a little bit more than 6 months, to be quite honest with you, and it would be quite a long time. That being said, in the spring of 1814, Zachary Taylor's given an opportunity. He says, they're basically like, hey man, do you want to go to St. Louis in the Missouri Territory? And he's just like, wait, what? I understand too, Missouri's not a state yet. That issue won't come up for another 6 years at this point. But Zachary Taylor's like, okay, because he's going to be given an opportunity to lead a big command of contingent of soldiers in St. Louis specifically, or the fort that's near St. Louis, I believe. God, what was it called? The Fort Johnson. Or that, I think that might be later, actually. I might be getting ahead of myself. Anyways, he decides, okay, I feel pretty good about it. I feel like this is a really good opportunity, and I'm basically gonna do it. So he initially heads there, and he's in charge of. He leaves his family behind, I believe. I don't remember if he takes them or not in this particular case, but he goes there, and he's initially in charge of about 400 men, 400 officers, and he's basically there like, why am I here? Why are we here? And he's basically explaining, hey man, you gotta keep this Mississippi River going, etc., etc. And then right as he's about to really start making some changes and doing some stuff, this general Benjamin Howard comes in, and he ends up being the guy who's going to supersede Zachary Taylor. And Zachary Taylor's a little bit bummed out, but at the very same time, he's like, I'll just follow the chain of command, I guess, do whatever I got to do, Ends up being really tactfully a good number 2 for Howard. And he's basically just there doing whatever he wants to do, which for Howard, he's just like, Gucci. Anyways, they decide to go down to Mississippi. Or they're basically just worried that the British were going to come down and take Mississippi, down the Mississippi River to take St. Louis. God, I cannot speak right now. Anyways, a lot of things are happening around this particular point in time. There's a whole bunch of different forts that are being attacked. They would actually lose a couple of American outposts during this particular conflict. And just seeing all the aggression, seeing all the frustration, seeing all the offensive nature of the British and the natives, Benjamin Howard's basically like, bruh, let's fucking do this, And then as soon as he's like, let's fucking do this, he gets really sick. Like so sick he can't do anything. I don't know what happened with him, but effectively once he gets sick, he's basically like, Zachary Taylor, please just continue my doing. Yeah, I'll give you instructions to do what you gotta do. So anyways, basically, Zachary Taylor from St. Louis goes north. He goes north and goes along the whole Mississippi River and really fights several forces left and right. The militiamen, he brings about 400 plus militiamen, rangers, etc. Anyone that he can have for the most part. A lot of his men get sick. I think a lot of his generals really get measles, I believe, but I'm not sure. They get really fucking sick though. So once they go up north to the area that is around, I think, Ohio, this area called the Rock River, what effectively will be known as the Battle for Credit Island, really begins. And this is a pretty fierce battle between Zachary Taylor and his Union Army versus the natives of that island. And the natives actually try and do a whole couple of different tricks. They start releasing horses to try and do a whole bunch of different routes to try and catch the Union soldiers off guard. But Zachary Taylor's like, And for the entire day, they fought left and right, shooting left and right. And then they took like a small breather, fell asleep, both sides, because they're just exhausted from the constant fighting. And dawn the next morning, more bullets are just starting to shoot each other. And despite losing a couple men, the Indians were basically just brutalized for the most part. They were defeated, but they would be joined eventually by about 30, 50 plus redcoats that are under the command of this guy named Duncan Graham. And basically just having this big-ass gun. I think it's like one of the early Gatling guns. I am not sure. It just says a 3-pounder in a lot of the biographies that I've read. Anyways, that 3-pound, I think it's artillery now I'm thinking about it. That artillery really just was beating on Taylor, and he was losing a lot of men, unfortunately, during this conflict. He would have, unfortunately, be really forced to retreat. A lot of people would say this is a defeat. I think this is both a draw in a lot of ways, because the Indians and the natives and the British really aren't going to be heading down to St. Louis anytime soon. So Zachary Taylor effectively ends up coming back, builds a whole bunch of different forts left and right. He built this fort at the junction of Des Moines and the Mississippi Rivers, which he called Fort Johnson. And he'd be there for quite a little bit, holding true for the most part to ensure that the British and the natives really don't go north or south, etc., etc. He's sending some. I think he does send some correspondence to his wife. He's like, "Hey, boo, how you doing?" And she's just like, "Can you all like not die on me? I'm praying for you, and I'm giving up my all that stuff for you." So he's just like, "Ooh, I guess my bad. Sorry, I guess I won't die." So for the better part of a couple months after this particular battle, Zachary Taylor ends up being called back to St. Louis because come to find out, General Howard himself ends up dying. And basically what ends up happening is there's really no point. The the war is kind of nearing its end a little bit on both sides. At the very least, the West is seeming like they're winning. The British are pushing their forces in another direction, and just for the most part, it just seems like the war is over in this particular part of the territory, conflict-wise. I mean, obviously not really, but it's enough for Zachary Taylor and his men, who have, again, short, enlistments, etc., and they're away from home. They can't pay everybody, and Zachary Taylor's basically just said, come back home, bring your men home. The war is effectively over. Destroy the fort. Do what you gotta do. So Zachary Taylor's a little bit bummed, but he's like, I get to be with my wife, so it's okay. So he destroys Fort Johnson, and he and his men return to St. Louis. And for the most part, the War of 1812 is kind of over for Zachary Taylor. It's over for a lot of people, but for him, he would soon leave the military for time. I mean, the reason why he ends up kind of leaving the war, it's two-pronged, but ultimately, one is he just wanted to be with his wife, etc. The monotony of the war itself it's difficult to really just go through. Imagine just like 6 months of doing nothing, and then it's really pointless in a lot of ways. And diversify your bounds, because Zachary Taylor's trying to be a moneymaker and a money man. But also, number two, he kind of felt a little bit disenfranchised by the government as well, specifically with his promotions and whatnot. It's a complicated issue, because he was a captain for most of the war, but he'd gotten so many accommodations. He led a whole bunch of contingent forces, and don't get me wrong, for the most part, he really didn't do much aside from a couple of specific instances. But in terms of just like the chain of command, etc., he should have probably been, promoted to a general. And then he just didn't, unfortunately. There's a multitude of reasons that I don't want to get into, but, part of it is like maybe some personal political backlash, etc. You know how it goes, politics. And then, he just didn't want to deal with that. He's not a really political person, per se. I would probably say he just didn't want to deal with any of that at all. So he decides, I'm going to go home. He goes home with his family to Louisville. At this point, he has 2 kids, and things are looking pretty good, He's focused on making corn, tobacco, and really kind of just doing his own thing and really pushing forward his own path in life and pushing forward his own future. Unfortunately, this is around 1814, 1815, probably around 1815 specifically. 1815 specifically, mid-1815 specifically, that he's actually fully retired and back in Louisville working on his plantation. Getting my dates mixed up. Apologize, guys. He's 28, 29 years old, and he's working on the farm doing his thing. And for like a little less than a year, he kind of hates being a farmer. It's not that he doesn't like being a farmer itself. It's just, it's monotonous. It's boring. And, he just wants some action and excitement in his life, and he decides he's going to try and go back into the military. So, there's 2 vacancies within the 3rd Infantry, I believe, of Kentucky, and they basically say, hey, do you want one of these spots? And he's just like, fuck yeah, I'll go back, And ironically, I think around that particular time too, the day he gets his accommodation and orders, his 3rd daughter is born, Margaret Taylor, on the same day. May of 1816, I believe, is when that day comes. So Taylor is now back in the military, in the Army, and specifically as a major. I'm probably going to be very brief about this particular point in time, because for the most part, from like 1816 to probably like, 1824, 1826, Zachary Taylor just goes from place to place in charge of specific forts, specific places and functions, and really doesn't do anything. His life, at least in a lot of ways, doesn't really pick up until the conflicts with really the natives, with the Black Hawk War, the Second Seminole War, etc., and then obviously the Mexican-American War. But for the most part, life for Zachary Taylor is just kind of just monotonous military work, busy work for the most part. So first and foremost, his first stop is Fort Howard. He would be there for basically almost 2 years, in which he's basically just overseeing the area that is known as Green Bay in the Michigan territory, the Detroit area, I guess you want to say, but Michigan in general, in that particular and specific area. And he hated it, because Louisville, you have to understand, has basically become like a full city. It's no longer a settlement. There's actual paved streets. Civilization is pretty Gucci. And Green Bay is just tough. His wife and daughters weren't able to make it for a big portion of the time. And, a lot of the people that were basically in Fort Howard, French. A lot of them French citizens, because, Quebec and the area over there. A lot of Indian wives, mistresses. It's a very, very, in relative comparison to Louisville, a very uncivilized place. And he's basically there for the next 2 years. And again, just really difficult. He's a very strict disciplinarian. He didn't get along with the general. General McCobb, who was there, and really it was just a very difficult time. So when he was given the opportunity in the summer of 1818 to go back to Louisville, he's like, fuck, I'm getting the hell out of here. And in which case, while still in the service of the military, he stayed in Louisville. He stayed in Louisville for another year. He was just waiting and farming and doing his normal thing, getting that military paycheck for the most part. And then he gets another promotion to lieutenant colonel, which he received in the spring, I believe, of 1819. And then around this particular time, too, I guess you could say, a couple of fascinating things happen. James Monroe is making his journey to the Western Outpost, and along with him is Major General Andrew Jackson, who just got done with all his stuff in Florida, and he's this grand leader, yada, yada, yada. And they ask him, hey, you want to come to dinner? And he was like, oh, really? You're gonna actually have dinner with me? Okay, cool, And they have dinner, and it's, first and foremost, can I just say, it's a very fascinating room that they're all in, and they're all eating and enjoying themselves, where there's 3 people in that room who are going to be presidents or are presidents. James Monroe at the time in 1819 is already the 5th president. Andrew Jackson would be president, and then Zachary Taylor. I think things like that are really, really interesting. Anyways, he comes back home. He's enjoying himself at home for the most part, and just really biding his time to really go out and do something, some exploring, some fighting, some honor, because Zachary Taylor's just like a lot of those men. He's like, I want to get my duty, get my honor. Unfortunately for Zachary Taylor, he wouldn't really be getting any fighting done. The government and army had other plans for him. He really didn't do much, like I said before, because this period of time, when he rejoins the army until the actual Black Hawk Wars, for instance, really nothing really occurs, if I'm going to be 100% honest with you. For the better part of a decade, until really 1828, like I said, he just goes from place to place, frontiers life for the most part, doing some more recruiting, left and right, and really just does his thing, whatever he could to, go on certain committees to consolidate, improve army organization, battle tactics, whatever he could do, for the most part. They really valued his ingenuity as a military leader, etc., etc. It was also be a very difficult time for the family, because his wife would join him on numerous occasions to go from place to place, as she just wanted to be with him the entire time, and it was just really difficult on her physically. And unfortunately, at one point, in one particular experience in the bayou, I believe, or in some place near where was it? In Louisiana, specifically, they actually, at one point, had contracted malaria. The entire family, including all his daughters, including little baby Taylor, in which he would unfortunately lose his 2 youngest daughters within the span of 4 months, which, don't know who you are, you lose 2 daughters in the span of 4 months. It is incredibly devastating. And I think that's also one thing that a lot of biographies point out too, that losing two of his daughters in that such a quick span, I think really emboldened, ironically, in Taylor's mind that none of his daughters should date anyone who's going to be doing the military life, which, if I'm going to be honest, I think it's kind of ironic that he should have probably left the military life, but he was hooked. He was hooked, unfortunately. Anyways, for, like I said, the next, I guess you could say, decade or so, he basically just does that and goes from place to place. So the family, in a lot of ways, does finally settle in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on the Mississippi River, and he remained there for quite a couple years, and would effectively end up buying a couple of plantations, effectively, and really just be a part of the Louisiana lifestyle, and buy their new home and make their new home in Baton Rouge for quite some time. So just like I said before, this entire time is really devoted for Zachary Taylor to learn new tactics, to communicate, train troops. His most of the time he took, I guess, in this weird kind of pre-period before the whole Mexican-American War and the whole issues with the natives, etc., he ultimately ends up just recruiting again. A lot of his time is just ultimately recruiting, but it's during this particular point in time too that he's gaining a lot of contacts, gaining a lot of notoriety, positive notoriety. He's a lieutenant colonel, but he's going to slowly rise through the ranks, and he's going to understand military politics very well. He's not going to like it, but he's going to understand it at the very least, which is very fundamental for him in order to achieve some prominence and actually gain some level of command for the most part. He's a soldier at this particular point in time. The nickname Rough and Ready is kind of starting to come around for Zachary Taylor. Rough and ready meaning, at least for him, that he's always a soldier. He's always there in the front lines with him. He's always rough and ready. He may not look presentable, but you know what? He's there. He's going to be capable, and above all else, he's going to fight. He's going to be prepared to fight. There's going to be many stories of him narrowly avoiding many bullets, gunshots, etc., A pretty ballsy dude by all accounts. And a lot of this time, too, he's also going to various different places: Wisconsin, Minnesota, Louisiana, Arkansas. States, not even states yet, he's going to, for the most part. Texas, those particular areas, Florida. And really, mainly being one of the individuals who understands the plight of Native Americans. For some people might actually say that he was a bit of a vicious warrior against Native Americans. He's probably more so along the lines of Andrew Jackson in his belief, where he's much more empathetic, understanding, and above all else, he'd rather choose the lesser of two evils kind of situation. But above all else, I think he understood, he understood the powers that, the white man had, and for the most part, a lot of his job was really protecting their lands, in particular, from invading white settlers who were kind of going into superseding their territory. And, occasionally it's kind of just like, well, this territory is debatable, so just to avoid conflict, and you should probably give up just this little inch, little things like that for the most part. Anyways, while all this is happening, there's a conflict growing, kind of in the northeast a little bit, the Michigan Territory, Wisconsin area. This chief, Black Hawk. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, well, it depends on how you look at it. Previously, in like the 1830s, there's this Indian chief named Black Hawk. He leads this Indian tribe called the Sauks, who occupied this region in northern Illinois, and he's basically like older, meaner, hates white people, kind of Tecumseh in a lot of ways, and he's really hating the thievery of their lands, etc., and really starts attacking a whole bunch of settlers, and a lot of conflicts would eventually occur with what would be known as the Black Hawk Wars. And Zachary Taylor is being called back in action in 1828, and is really being given an opportunity in a lot of ways to see what's going to happen with these rising conflicts that are occurring and that would be really occurring for the next 3 to 4 years. Understand this too. There's actually a lot of people that are involved. Sorry, I don't know why my throat's like this. A lot of people involved in this particular conflict, notably another future president in Abraham Lincoln, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, and also future son-in-law, I might want to add, and, a little-known general who's going to be helping him within the Mexican-American War itself, General Winfield Scott. So when given this opportunity, he goes into the Michigan Territory that is now Minnesota. Initially, he kind of goes back there. He goes back and forth, to be honest with you. He's traveling through the Mississippi River and goes to Fort Crawford in that particular area for about a year and gets some time to really go back and forth between Baton Rouge and Fort Crawford. And during this time, he's really just diversifying his bounds, getting a whole bunch of land, etc., and really trying to get, that actual colonelship. He's trying to get that promotion, and it's kind of being a pain in the ass because there's a couple people that are trying to stop him, unfortunately, from actually getting it. But he does get eventually promoted in April of 1832. So what does Taylor do, really, for the most part, during this particular point in time? The normal stuff. He tries to quell some native issues, etc. He just does what he's always been doing. Most of the time for Zachary Taylor's career, it's just been recruiting, stopping native conflicts with the white settlers, etc., and just trying to get that money, fam. Just trying to get that money. And he really toils in this particular point in time, especially with the exceptionally rising conflicts that are going to be occurring with natives that really, for the better part of this decade, are going to really expand and really blow up in particular. And which is why I left the whole Second Seminole Wars a little bit with Zachary Taylor instead of talking about it with Martin Van Buren or Andrew Jackson. In April of 1832, ironically, partially also because of the rising conflicts that are occurring with Chief Black Hawk and his Sauk tribe, Sauks, I don't know, S-A-U-K, excuse me. It's become very apparent that conflicts are rising and war is on the horizon. So Taylor actually gets his promotion, ends up becoming the colonel of the 1st Infantry Regiment, and under General Atkinson, war begins between Chief Black Hawk and the United States. Sorry, I don't know why I'm so gassy right now. The Black Hawk War is a very fascinating war. It's a very complicated war, too. The entire history of it goes far beyond, I could argue, like 20 years even. It really starts with a disputed treaty, I guess you could say. A lot people stepping and overseeing the boundaries of lands, etc. Chief Black Hawk's like, bruh, get the fuck off my lands, fam. You know what I'm saying? And a lot of the United States basically is like, bro, I'm not on your lands. This is what it is. And Black Hawk's like, no, it isn't. I'll show you. So he ends up crossing, I believe, the Mississippi River, and ends up kind of freaking out a bunch of United States officials, etc., because they're like, hey, man, don't go. Don't do this. And Black Hawk's like, bruh, you gonna try and fuck me up? You know what I'm saying? Yeah, like, in fairness, this is much more of a tension building kind of situation and just intimidation tactics that Black Hawk was doing. Or at least that's how the United States saw it. I don't know why I'm talking all gangster like that. But anyways, Black Hawk crosses the Mississippi River, increases tensions, and then specifically Zachary Taylor and his leader initially, what is his name? General Atkinson. They initially go over and they meet with a whole bunch of different chiefs, native chiefs specifically. I believe the Meskwaka chief. There's a whole bunch of native tribes. Sorry if I'm messing this up brutally. But anyways, he meets a whole bunch of them. And he's basically saying, hey guys, can you just not do anything and not do this and not escalate tensions and also not side with Chief Black Hawk? And a lot of the chiefs are kind of just a little bit turned off by that. Even Zachary Taylor himself is kind of just like, bruh, come on, man, you could do a little bit better than that. And for the most part, they're basically it was a little bit of a, I guess you could say, a mild threat in some aspects. It depends on how you look at things. Atkinson is basically just saying, look, man, if you guys keep doing this, we're going to have to fuck you guys up. That's just how it's going to go. And a lot of the chiefs are hearing this, and a lot of things are happening. Because first and foremost, unlike Tecumseh, Black Hawk doesn't have a lot of support from other native tribes. They're not united at all. And in fact, when potential war occurs, all the Black Hawk supporters are basically like, bro, you're on your own. We're not doing this shit, you know? And Black Hawk's kind of like, okay, maybe I overstepped my boundaries. Is there any way for peace? And then, unfortunately, that's not going to happen with a particular instance. This incident would be known as the Battle of Stillman's Run. Basically what happened was there's a whole bunch of different militia. They're trying to communicate. They're under General Atkinson. They're trying to communicate with a whole bunch of different people. There's a whole bunch of different miscommunications going around. And long story short, under, I guess you could say, again, a gross miscommunication. Because truth be told, we really don't even know the whole story. What ends up happening is in the Battle of Stillman's Run, Black Hawk and his band of what is known as British band of natives killed about 12 Illinois militiamen and suffering only 3 fatalities. Because basically, it's again miscommunication. Some group of Atkinson's men were actually on the pursuit of Black Hawk for the most part, and they had sent a small contingent of men up ahead to try and track him down and try to talk to him and try to communicate with him and try to pursue him. And ultimately, natives basically will say, hey, we tried to do the white flag thing and we tried to do all these orders, and for the most part, it doesn't really work. Because basically, the United States is kind of like, oh, we didn't see a white flag, you know? Again, I really don't know. No one can really fundamentally understand what actually happens during this particular incident, but this is the actual, you know, lighter for the actual TNT itself. That will be the battle, or the Black Hawk War. Sorry. So like I said, it's just rising tensions. You know, first it's Black Hawk crossing the river, then people just miscommunicating and threats on both sides, and then this Battle of Stillman's Run basically begins the Black Hawk War. And the Black Hawk War itself really is just like 3 months. 3 months of various different battles. Black Hawk getting imprisoned, I believe, and trying to seek refuge and stuff, and a lot of deaths. Just a lot of death on both sides. And Zachary Taylor himself is just witnessing most of this. He's seeing a lot of this happen, and he's seeing many things just occur in terms of the horrors that he's seeing. And it becomes a little bit hard because of that, you know, on both sides of the actual ideological spectrum, I guess you could say, in terms of the treatment with natives. Because more often than not, he actually ended up sympathizing with the plight of the natives, especially around this particular point in time. And he really disliked the incompetence of militia units, and specifically citizen militia units, that he ended up being forced to command, really. First and foremost because they were very undisciplined in comparison to their disciplined and fierce Indian foes, you know. And this also really put in perspective a lot of things for Zachary Taylor, you know, and really showed that despite, you know, having empathetic feelings toward the natives and Indians, the only thing that was really going to stop them, for just every single sense of the word, from attacking a lot of the settlers, the white settlers, was going to be a very strong military presence. Anything less than that was going to just lead to chaos and situations that might occur, like the Black Hawk War, which, you know, unfortunately occurred. I mean, if I'm going to be honest, at least in terms of Zachary Taylor's perspective, and a lot of people's perspective on the Black Hawk War was just grossly, just really pointless, grossly unnecessary, and really aggressive on the side of the United States, which I actually tend to agree with. And don't get me wrong, natives in a lot of ways and in some people's perspective, might have started it. But, the United States, especially around this particular point in time, they overstepped their boundaries a little bit, and they basically just showed a lot of force in this particular point in time. Understand, too, that Andrew Jackson, during the war, the Black Hawk Wars themselves, he's president, and while he has sympathy of the natives, too, he's a man of basically just like, hey, they're going to try and show us up, and that's not going to happen, okay? So you're going to end up just show them the fuck up. We're the United States of America, goddammit. Huzzah. Anyways, it's around this particular point in time, too, that with his family up here in this particular point in time, a young Jefferson Davis begins courting Sarah Knox Taylor, much to the chagrin of Zachary Taylor, which I think is really fascinating. He actually really liked Jefferson Davis. He's like, this guy is a really brave, strong, very well-respected Southern brother, and I actually really like what he represents, etc., etc. Please don't marry my daughter, though. I will give you the blessing, etc., etc. But I don't want my daughter to have to go through the life, unfortunate, of a military wife for the most part. So, after this entire Black Hawk War, Colonel, now Zachary Taylor, kind of goes back home. He does more of the normal stuff again that he's used to, I guess, doing the whole, I'm going to come up with different types of attack plans, etc., etc., on how to actually defeat people, because I have a lot more combat experience, and I've actually led some troops into the actual, he's a capable leader, for the most part, and can I understand at the end of the Black Hawk War, basically Indian resistance in that particular area is gone. They're just gonna basically just do whatever the white man says, for better and definitely for worse. But for Zachary Taylor, this is just about him kind of just getting things ready for expansion, and then he goes on more of the recruiting, the normal stuff, for quite some time. Again, diversifying his bonds also too. Later on, though, after a very long courtship with Jefferson Davis, knows him pretty well. Jefferson Davis asks for his daughter's hand in marriage, and he's kind of just like, fuck. Well, okay, fine, whatever. Fine, go for it. And then Jefferson Davis and his daughter, Sarah Knox Taylor, end up getting married in June of 1835. And then she dies, literally 3 months later. God, it's pretty fucking tragic. She gets malaria when she goes to goes with Jefferson Davis to visit his family at home in Louisiana. God, losing 3 daughters, that's gotta be fucking tragic. Then don't get me wrong, that would be the last one he would lose in his lifetime. The other 3 would actually grow into old age, but it was a very emotionally, even very physically depleting experience for him and his wife. And I mean, she would eventually suffer from ill health due to her contraction, Margaret, specifically with her contraction, malaria, and obviously as well 6 kids, their last kid being in 1826. And when she's basically in her mid-30s, when she has their son, Richard, who by the way actually became a Confederate general. I just want to point that out too. So, but a very emotionally and very difficult specific time for the Taylors. And, for him, he really put more effort into his work and really tried in a lot of ways to figure out. It was a bit of a, I guess you could say kind of like a crossroads moment of what he wanted to do for the most part. Country first or my family, because, they're going to be coming with me in a lot of different places, although a lot of them are getting older, getting on with their lives, and I just hope that they choose the right path, etc., etc. What's going to be best for me and my wife, etc. And again, she was just going to support him no matter what. And it was a very difficult period of time for the Taylors. But unfortunately, for Zachary Taylor, as he's trying to really decide what he's going to end up doing, whether he's going to leave the military or whatnot, he's called upon to do his duty for the most part, as what is known as the Second Seminole War is really kind of getting underway, specifically in the particular area in the Seminole area in Florida, I believe. Anyways, the Second Seminole War. The Second Seminole War is a very fascinating war. I kind of just want to do a specific episode on it as well. And for Zachary Taylor, just to really dumb it down, obviously it's a series of conflicts against, obviously, the Seminole Indians, which, Florida State, Zachary Taylor effectively, although he's a colonel, he's not going to be in charge with a whole bunch of different campaigns, etc. So he's not the major general. That's Thomas Jessup, I believe, was his actual commander at the particular point in time. And Thomas Jessup, by the way, is a very fascinating historical figure. Some people will call him the father of the modern quartermaster corps. 52 years in the military. He's one of the longest histories of in the United States Army, by the way. And basically for him, he's basically going to be leading this campaign to penetrate into the Seminole territory and to really just try and trap and fight large forces of Seminoles within Florida itself. And Zachary Taylor was just in charge of supply depots, communication centers, recruitment, little things that you can think of for the most part. And it just sucks for Zachary Taylor because he's just relegated to a whole bunch of different shit like that. He's basically just building forts. He would build Fort Gardiner and Fort Basinger. So, like I said before, he's like, sorry, love, I gotta go do this. This is my duty. Yada yada yada. And she's like, just go do it. I get it. This is what you gotta do. Okay, so he goes and supports his country in the actual Second Seminole Wars, even though it's still a very emotionally rough time for Zachary Taylor and the family as well. This, though, in these actual Seminole Wars, would actually, for him, actually get some real opportunity for combat and for some actual fighting for the most part. Very early on, in the very beginning, it's known as the Battle of Lake Okeechobee. I'm terrible with a lot of these fucking pronunciations. Anyways, this is actually probably the most famous battle that Zachary Taylor within the actual Second Seminole War would be a part of. It's also a bit of a vicious battle, unfortunately for Zachary Taylor, as he would lose a large contingent of his own men, unfortunately. You see, along with Thomas Jessup, Zachary Taylor is basically given about 140 plus troops, and he decides he's going to charge head on against these men, but against these Indians for the most part. Mud, water, and it is just a trial for the most part for Zachary Taylor and his men. And he ends up basically just going straight into the swamp in a direct attack against the Indians. And he's criticized a little bit because he should be encircling the Indians and making it much more difficult because they have a larger contingent force. But all his men were on foot, and a lot of his men were just in lines and just trying to shoot the Indians and kill them in any way that they possibly could. And I think, in fact, he ends up losing one of his colonels, or one of the colonels ends up dying. And all in all, about 112 soldiers end up getting wounded, 26 of them getting killed, and despite the natives being forced to retreat, it's a very, very costly loss for Zachary Taylor. And despite the loss, though, a lot of people are kind of like, oh, this guy's pretty old, rough and ready. He's capable. Yada yada yada. So, technically speaking, for a real first genuine fight, real genuine conflict, it's a complicated matter for Zachary Taylor, but one that he would learn a lot from, and one that would be a very consequential victory / loss in a lot of ways for Zachary Taylor. He would end up being promoted to brigadier general as a result, and again, the nickname Old Rough and Ready came mostly due to this specific battle. So after the battle, Zachary Taylor is really vibing. He's really feeling himself. He's kind of hyped in a lot of ways. And this is around the time that Thomas Jessup would step down and he's going to do a whole bunch of different things, which effectively makes Zachary Taylor the new brigadier general and in command of all American troops in Florida. He actually holds his position for about a year and a half, for quite some time, and this is where his reputation really begins growing, since he's leading this large contingent group of forces. A lot of things happen. He starts starting a correspondence with William Henry Harrison, because he's really thinking about his future around this particular point in time. He's definitely not getting any younger. He's really seriously thinking about retirement, since money is very secure with him and his family. Like I said before, the land that his father alone just lent him in Kentucky is probably worth about $6 million today, in today's money. So he's a very, very financially sound individual. And ironically, during this particular point in time too, he's really just going along with land speculation, etc., etc. I believe partly in the Florida area, but when he leaves Florida in a couple of years after leading all these men, he actually gets stationed in Arkansas at one point, where he does do a lot more land speculation and other military matters and whatnot. And it's unfortunate, because a lot of things don't really happen for Zachary Taylor until the beginning of the Mexican-American War. So really, from, I guess you could say, 1838 to 1844, Zachary Taylor's kind of just chilling, vibing, trying to figure out what he's going to do. He's even, because he's doing all these military meetings and whatnot. He even starts thinking about politics, but he knows nothing about politics. This is when he starts a correspondence with William Henry Harrison, before he dies, unfortunately. But he's basically just asking, how does a man who has basically just a military man get into the actual, the whole political gain? And William Henry Harrison's like, well, pretty simply, yada yada yada. Yeah, it's inconsequential, really, because it's not the longest correspondence. He effectively ends up just building his military resume, I guess you could say. He ends up being a commander of the 2nd Department of the Army's Western Division in 1841, and really just controls a large, sizable territory, basically anything westward of the Mississippi, and south of, I think, what it was, what is it, the 37th parallel, and he's stationed in Arkansas, which is the whole reason why he's doing that. Basically, all that territory he's going to be covering, and unfortunately for him, it's going to include a little place called Mexico in Texas. He also, I want to add too, was still just really doing the same shit as before. Diversifying his lands. He bought more lands, bought another plantation in Mississippi, in the Baton Rouge area. Although much more land, a lot more slaves too. He, at this point, he had greatly increased his slave holdings. But ironically, the family would still live in a very modest cottage for most of their lives, unfortunately, by choice, I guess you could say. He was a very financially frugal individual. He had also just been dealing with a whole bunch of different disputes between natives and settlers, also really just siding with the natives in a lot of those particular disputes, and really just training his soldiers in capability, as there's a shit ton of rising tensions that you can see from the get-go with Texas. Obviously in 1840, actually much earlier, Texas becoming a sovereign state, and John Tyler for the next couple years really trying to annex Texas. So, things happen. Zachary Taylor was a man of opportunity, for the most part. He was actually given the opportunity to protect the lands from Mexico, specifically, and then basically any attack from Mexico that was going to be potential, with the rising tensions with the annexation of Texas in 1844, when James K. Polk becomes president. And he was also given command specifically of that specific force as well. The command that was going to go and cross into the whole Rio Grande area, that was going to excite and incite war for the most part. Depends on how you look at it for James K. Polk. It's a bit of a mixed bag for me. And I kind of really briefly talked about some of the politics that came along with the Mexican-American War, at least a lot of the generalizations, the different fronts that would eventually occur. And, just for Zachary Taylor, we're going to really just talk about his specific influence within the Mexican-American War. So for Zachary Taylor, he's kind of just been vibing this entire time. He's enjoying himself. He's doing whatever his country needs of him. He's a very just plain-spoken man, just a very plain and just one that, if he's just going to do his duty, he's just going to do what he's going to do for the most part. Everyone that he ends up under his command for the most part just loves him. He's old, rough, and ready for a reason. And when he's in Louisiana, he's in charge of, north of 1,500 to numbers estimate. It's probably close to like 2,000 to 3,000 men. It's a sizable group of men that Zachary Taylor would be in charge of. And I understand that's a lot of men to station by the Rio Grande to protect and all that stuff. So it seemed like a bit of an aggressive action by James K. Polk and whatnot. But Zachary Taylor gets this opportunity to protect, any attempts for Mexico to reclaim their territory, and he is the one that goes to the Rio Grande and for Taylor's men to advance in 1846. But real quick before we get to all that, understand that he gets this because of politics, okay? Because Zachary Taylor would eventually become a Whig, but his politics were very ambiguous. He's always been politically ambiguous, and I think partially too, just first and foremost, the military political game. He doesn't want to play sides and doesn't want anyone to hate him, because people pick their opponents, people pick their sides, and he doesn't want to be left out of a particular promotion. And in this particular case, it helps him immensely, because there's actually several more senior generals that are supposed to actually take command of, basically do a whole bunch of different things that are going to help protect America during the whole Mexican-American conflict. Notably, Winfield Scott and Edmund Gaines, but because they had clear Whig affiliations, Polk's kind of just like, Taylor's just going to do the job. He's going to do his thing. He's going to do everything. And hopefully, and in fairness, had things been different, Zachary Taylor probably would have been a Democrat. So, anyways, he directs him specifically to the disputed territory in Texas, which is on or near the Rio Grande. He chooses the spot, Corpus Christi, and he basically is encamped there until the following spring in anticipation, for some sort of attack that may or may not occur. And again, for Taylor, you have to understand, it really sucks. He's just chilling. He's vibing. He writes home to his wife, etc., etc. And being on the Rio Grande, it's pretty fucking boring. Anyways, he builds his forts, etc., etc. He's basically just stationed there for the better part for quite some time. I don't know if he's able to go back or not. Specifically, a lot of the biographies just go straight to the point when it comes to Zachary Taylor, unfortunately, and just his time with on the Rio Grande. But what is known is that by the time March of 1846 occurs, and war is very apparent with the different and just the horrible negotiations by Polk at this particular point in time, and him playing hardball and the Mexican government playing even harder hardball, war appears very, very likely. And Zachary Taylor, who's a relative unknown, and both in military life and I don't want to say military life, but because he's a very well known and well respected military general, but he's no Winfield Scott, that Zachary Taylor's just vibing. He's chilling, and he doesn't have any national notoriety, at least until the Thornton affair. Which is not actually specifically the Thornton affair. It's just the Thornton affair really being the precipice and beginning of the Mexican-American War. So while he's there with his large contingent of troops, really just trying to take care of them, make sure they don't die of heat exhaustion, etc., make sure the whole supply chains go around, and they're well supplied and well fed, and kept up to speed, and kept up to snuff, and capable. the Thornton Affair occurs. The Thornton Affair really being Mexico launching some surprise attacks against a couple of dragoons, cavalry regiments, namely one of them being led by this guy Thornton, and ultimately ends up being the spark for the entire Mexican-American War. Zachary Taylor gets a couple of reports of what actually happens, and he's like, what the fuck? Are they actually trying to start a war, fam? Damn, son, it's about to go down. And Zachary Taylor's kind of just like, kind of chomping at the bit in a lot of ways. He's just like, finally, I'm about to get my glory. It took me goddamn 20 plus years, but I'm about to get my glory. And immediately after, the Mexican forces start attacking a whole bunch of other fucking places, unfortunately, notably in, I believe, Texas, or Fort Texas, I believe. They were leading the siege on Fort Texas, in which case Taylor's army is basically there. He just, fuck it, we gotta go, we're getting word. So within basically a month span, war starts, and the first big victory for the United States of America will be known as the Battle of Palo Alto, in which briefly the forces occur and they start fighting each other. And despite having a larger force, Mariano Arista having a much larger force, Zachary Taylor is just much more well prepared, well trained, above all else has much better superior artillery and gunpowder, etc. We are Gucci and they are Walmart. Okay, that's just the best way I can explain it for the most part in terms of artillery and capabilities. And soon after Arista losing a lot of men, ends up being forced to retreat. This victory becoming the first true victory for the United States of America in the Mexican-American War. After that, battles after battles. The next day, the armies clash at Resaca de la Palma, and Americans are just defeating Mexican soldiers, this time with hand-to-hand combat. Dragoons just slicing the enemy's guns, and a lot of these Mexican soldiers, they were very unprepared. First and foremost, you have to understand, these American soldiers, they had basically spent the better part of a year bored training. That was one of the biggest worries for Zachary Taylor, was just, the boredom of the men being really troublesome. They might get into mischievous things, and ultimately, fighting, getting their angers and frustrations out on the Hispanics, who are being pretty really hostile towards the United States at this particular point in time. And these battles, these victories, a lot of them in quick succession, bam, 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 bam. They start really spreading very much eastward, I guess you could say, both to the United States itself and to Mexico. And both sides obviously having their respective I guess you could say reactions. Mexico being like, oh, this is Zachary Taylor, and then James K. Polk like, fuck yeah, fam, you my homeboy, I guess I did choose right, And a lot of people really start kind of building up the legend of Zachary Taylor, one of his soldiers would write, he looks more like a farmer going to the market, jovial and good-natured. He was West Point spit and polish, but an officer who... He was not West Point spit and polish, but an officer who was experienced, tough, and reliable. He was fiercely loyal to his men, and a lot of people basically just writing home to him. Notably, at this particular point in time, Ulysses S. Grant, who was, I believe, the quartermaster, or one of the specific men who was in charge of a whole bunch of different things, was under the command of Zachary Taylor himself. We actually got to see him firsthand. You need to understand that, the word going out, too, is that, people were basically like, oh my God, is he going to run for president? And Taylor's like, I have a war to fight, so what are you guys, doing right now, trying to do all this stuff, politics, am I right? But, it doesn't help, too, that, after these successive victories, Zachary Taylor's just getting promoted left and right. Basically by June, he's literally a major general. And a lot of people in the national press saying, this is the next Andrew Jackson, yada, yada, yada. And he's like, whoa. I've actually hung out with Andrew Jackson. I'm nothing like Andrew Jackson. Chill. You know what I'm saying? Anyways, basically Zachary Taylor during this entire time is getting word you're in the north. You're going down south, and you're going to try and do whatever you can in the north. You're going to fight and conquer as much as you can in the north in this particular, front of the actual Mexican-American War. His next task, once he crosses the Rio Grande officially, is to go to the town of Monterrey, in the actual city itself, and it takes quite a few days. I don't understand. This is a very difficult battle, okay? So he goes there. That's the next strategic objective. And they were basically waiting for a whole bunch of different things, because you have to understand, despite having a lot of troops, he wasn't particularly well supplied in equipment and specifically transportation. They didn't have wagons to haul a lot of their supplies, unfortunately. And basically, this actually caused him to really split his forces in order to keep a relative supply chain going. Anyways, for several days, 3 to 5 days, it's probably a fascinating battle to actually be a part of. A lot of it is just street fighting with one another. Americans engaging with the Mexicans in the actual streets themselves. And Mexico basically ended up giving up after about 3 to 5 days of fighting because they were running out of ammo. They couldn't support themselves. It was a very tumultuous time. They just could not do it. And Zachary Taylor there was being very generous. He granted them a 2-month armistice and allowed their soldiers to take their guns and their artillery. And a lot of people were really surprised by that, I guess you could say James K. Polk wasn't very happy when he got word of it, but in particular, a lot of people were really surprised by that. You have to understand, Zachary Taylor is not a very bad person. Slave owner, etc., whatever you want to call him. And whatever your opinion is of slave owners, but Zachary Taylor during this entire war might have been one of the better humanitarians. It's very clear he was an emotionally capable and empathetic and sympathetic individual. A lot of Mexican soldiers that were captured were given, the same treatment health-wise and were very well treated for the most part. Notably, a lot of the soldiers who were hurt on the Mexican side getting the exact same treatment the Americans were, given their last rites. They were all buried properly and no desecrations whatsoever. Zachary Taylor in this war, I don't think he wanted to fight it. And, the more the war went on, I think he was less in tune to fight it, if I'm going to be 100% honest with you. But, for him it was a duty. And it was an honor, and it was a battle. And, he respected his opponent above all else. And that's Zachary Taylor. Unfortunately for Zachary Taylor, politics would really ring and just barge their ugly head in. Polk was getting word that Taylor might actually be a presidential candidate, and specifically a Whig presidential candidate. Although it's complicated, it probably wasn't a reality that he wanted to actually be a presidential candidate. But there's rumblings. There's a potential reality. And ultimately, Polk probably sealed the fact that he was going to attempt to be a presidential candidate when he took a large contingent of Zachary Taylor's forces and gave it to Winfield Scott. And he basically just said, look, Winfield Scott is going to lead this force to Mexico City, and he has a less likely chance at this particular point in time than, say, Zachary Taylor to actually become president, so I'm going to give it to him and hope he doesn't make it. That's kind of like the mindset of Polk in a lot of ways. And partly, too, I think he wanted Zachary Taylor to end up just quit, just give in and give up. And he wasn't about to do that at all. Because Zachary Taylor's basically like, look, man, I'm pretty pissed, but you know what? I have my men, I have my position. It's going to be a long trek back. We're going to just do our duty and do our job. So, Zachary Taylor had roughly, and this is a rough estimate, about 5,000 men. He's going to hold this specific defensive position in near the town of Saltillo. And unfortunately, like I said earlier in the very, 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 very early opening, Santa Anna, who's taking control of the army, gets word of this. And he's basically just like, haha, they're free and open, and effectively decides he's going to attack. And he attacks Zachary Taylor at the Battle of Buena Vista in February of 1847, on Washington's birthday, I want to add. The battle is very fierce, and United States men just show their power, show their strength, and really brilliant artillery, I might want to add, by Zachary Taylor. And for Zachary Taylor, he ends up basically just getting away with some grazes. He had been shot at several times, and specifically being shot and grazed on his left arm, avoiding some cannon fire. Zachary Taylor was kind of a badass, and a lot of people basically just were just like, dude, this guy's a fucking legend. And any battle in particular, which is one of the biggest reasons why I chose this battle in particular for Zachary Taylor in the very opening, was because this battle all assured him that if he wanted to run for president, he could. This battle made him a potential president. That's how important this battle is, just because of how capable he was and how strong he was, and how he basically just defeated Santa Anna in a lot of ways, forced Santa Anna to ultimately retreat. He may have lost a shit ton of men, but you know what? Santa Anna lost a lot of his own men too, and they were clearly outmatched despite some staggering losses for the United States military and Zachary Taylor's regiment. I should also note the Battle of Buena Vista too, technically speaking, would be truly the last battle and last real effective action that Zachary Taylor would have during the Mexican-American War. Most of his men at this particular point being funneled into Veracruz with General Winfield Scott, and they're attacking Mexico City. And while he stayed at Monterrey specifically, his entire military career is kind of over, and he decides he's going to just leave in November, and as the Mexican-American War is kind of winding down, to be honest with you, at this particular point in time. So he goes home, and he goes home to Baton Rouge specifically, and really just begins contemplating his future in a lot of ways. And really, let me explain, because like I said before, he really contemplates his future, and while there was presidential talk, I don't think, by all accounts, he was ever strongly considering a presidential nomination or bid. Although it is very clear that, functionally speaking, he and Polk did not get along, and Polk kind of rubbed him the wrong way, and above all else, Polk doing what he did ultimately kind of just solidified any doubt that Polk or that Taylor was going to run for president. He was basically just like, you fucked me over, I'm gonna run for president now. So you can kind of just screw off James K. Polk. Zachary Taylor is at home, though, and he's basically just chilling, enjoying his life with whatever kids he has left, unfortunately, at this particular point in time. And Margaret's not doing too hot. She would basically just be physically debilitated for the rest of her life. She would actually live for only a couple years after Zachary Taylor, when he dies, unfortunately. Taylor himself is not in the greatest of health either, especially during this entire campaign. Was really wearing on Zachary Taylor. He really wore rough and ready, if that makes any sense. He's very physically sunburnt, etc., dirty a lot, and he's just used to wearing whatever he was wearing, so he was never really a proper worn individual specifically. Anyways, like I said before, he really wasn't trying to become the president, but he left it open, and he basically just said, look, if you guys do want to put me in as your presidential nominee, fine, I'll do whatever y'all want me to do. It'll be Gucci. I guess I'll try it out. So he's at home though, but he leaves it open for a lot of people while he's at home, and the Whig convention itself to elect their presidential nominee, it's pretty fascinating. Henry Clay is still there, by the way, and he's about 70, and he's just basically trying to get one more crack at the presidency in what is basically a very contentious and capable year. It's kind of sad for Henry Clay, because I feel like if any year he was going to win it was probably going to be this year. At least hypothetically and potentially it could have been this year. But he was 70. Let's just be honest. Anyways, he's kind of like low-key begging Zachary Taylor to kind of like, can you just say that you're not going to do it, just to confirm that you're not going to actually run, etc., etc. And, Zachary Taylor's like, I can't say that, bro. And he's like, well, fuck. Well, anyways, the Whigs choose him, and they choose a very young and fascinating man, I believe from Buffalo, named Millard Fillmore to be his vice president. The election of 1848 is pretty interesting, to be quite honest with you. In fact, it's quite funny in a lot of ways, because Zachary Taylor had actually, first and foremost, he doesn't really have any specific political beliefs. He never really had anything that was going to really fucking go about it. In fact, he never voted, like I said before, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that he was always constantly going around. So often he's getting mail that's like backed up like 6 months, from before. In fact, for when he's getting the nomination, he didn't actually know about it for quite some time until like fucking weeks after. He's like, oh, you're nominating me for president? Who's this motherfucker named Millard Fillmore? My name's a kid Fillmore. Or Millard. I don't know. Anyways, the election itself is really, really interesting. It was basically the Democrats had Lewis Cass, who's going against Zachary Taylor, and it's fascinating because this is I think the last real attempt for Martin Van Buren for the Free Soil Party, and a lot of his votes would effectively end up being taken away from the actual Democratic Party, ironically speaking. This was a very complicated election because it was the Democrats trying to really push forward a lot of policies and whatnot, and ultimately it really didn't work because the Whigs were doing the exact same shit that they did in the election of 1840, which is basically, hey, look, we got this war guy, he's totally awesome, vote for him, and it was really difficult because, policy versus war, etc., etc. And technically speaking, for the Democrats, they kind of had, they were stuck in their specific, pledge and their specific what's the right word to explain? They were stuck on their subjects, I guess you could say. I'm very tired. I can't think properly right now. And Zachary Taylor, like for instance, the big subject, obviously, which was exponentially growing, was slavery, and specifically slavery in the new territories. The Lewis Cass specifically was like, "Will not proviso, no, we don't want that," and Zachary Taylor's like, I own slaves, but you know what? I don't know anything about the issue. I fought in the war. Haha, That was basically, in a very dumbed down way, the election of 1848. Anyways, by the end of the election, Zachary Taylor will win the presidency. Zachary Taylor wins about 47% of the popular vote. He wins about 163 electoral votes. The big one in particular, is New York and Pennsylvania. Martin Van Buren takes a lot of those northeastern votes that would normally be Northern Democrats away from Lewis Cass, and ultimately, in a lot of ways, Martin Van Buren ends up taking close to 300,000 votes away. And this was a pretty contested election, to be quite honest with you. And which really sucks for Lewis Cass, because he unfortunately just gets the shittier end of the stick for the most part. But as of right now, Zachary Taylor wins the election, and it effectively becomes the 12th president of the United States of America. And I do plan to do a deep dive onto the election of 1848, because this election itself and just the nominating process, I think, is really, really interesting. Also, the first time that Texas as a state gets electoral votes, or I don't know if this is the first time, but Texas gets electoral votes for in this particular election. What is the country like when Zachary Taylor becomes president? Interesting. Zachary Taylor is going to be the first president that's going to have to deal with all the land that James K. Polk really acquires during his presidency, which is half the fucking country, unfortunately. and specifically going to have to deal with a lot of the issues that are going to come around, notably with the increased reality that they're going to be arguing about slavery in the new territories, the Wilmot Proviso, and ultimately, California is going to be a huge problem because it's over the, I think the 47th parallel that the Missouri Compromise actually exists. I might be getting the parallel wrong. I do apologize, but for the next 2 years that he would effectively become president, this issue is just going to be completely dominating his presidency, and really the country as a whole. The rising tensions of abolition versus slavery really start reaching a fever pitch, and not only just in specifically just in everyday people, but in Congress as well. I might be wrong. This might be later on in Franklin Pierce's presidency, if I'm correct. But the infamous stick fighting, I guess like the cane beating that one Democrat congressman gives to another congressman, in particular for the slavery issue itself within the halls of Congress. It's not very good. Not very good. This country is very politically and specifically ideologically divided between both North, South, and specifically slavery abolition for the most part. That being said, though, everything is happening. A lot of things are happening. Culture is changing. The North is really becoming a really big industrial center. This is, I guess, in a lot of ways, the beginnings of what would be known as the Second Industrial Revolution. The Second Industrial Revolution is the specific industrial revolution that really creates a lot of the insane technological advancements. The expansion of like railroads, etc., coal powered stuff. Really influencing a lot of things. Iron becoming a really big I don't want to say invention, but product that really becomes, it's kind of like the Iron Age a little bit. And, Germany in a lot of ways really leads the world in this, with, Britain very closely behind, America very closely there too, which would then lead into, the Gilded Age of America in a lot of ways. And, this idea of populism and a whole bunch of different things that would eventually be coming. A lot of it really begins here, during Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore's term too, because this is also where trade is really going to start really expanding. Now that you actually have the Pacific Coast, you can start trading with Asia. This is where we're at with the country during Zachary Taylor's presidency. First and foremost, Zachary Taylor will not have any Supreme Court justice nominations or picks. He does not live long enough for any spot to really open up. So I just want to get that one out of the way. His cabinet is really interesting. I don't think he knows, for the most part, what he really wanted in a cabinet. He didn't appoint any Democrats, I'm going to point out. And in fact, most of the people that would be in his cabinet would effectively be part of the Republican Party later on and influence the Civil War, which I think is really interesting and fascinating. But he really didn't know, I think, what he really wanted in a cabinet. He wanted one thing, though. He wanted to have his entire administration, his cabinet, to really reflect, the country. A lot of them are really all about geography, because this is the big issue, unfortunately, around this particular point in time, is a sectionalism. He didn't want to choose the bigwigs, though. He wanted to choose like low key guys, like he didn't want to choose, Hillary Clinton. He'd rather choose Tulsi Gabbard, kind of the lower kind of rising stars in a lot of ways. And a lot of these guys were rising stars, He wanted to choose Crittenden, who was actually, I think, the governor of Kentucky at the particular point in time. But he was a close friend, and he basically said, nah, I'm okay. I'd rather be just the governor of Kentucky, and let me be that. So he actually selected not selected, but offered John M. Clayton for Delaware. He was a close associate of Crittenden's, and he would actually be the guy who would be the Secretary of State. And one of his closest advisors, he really, really valued Clayton's aid. And Clayton was one of the great orators of his particular time in comparison to his contemporaries. He was really incredible and a fantastic speaker. After that, most of the other remaining congressmen would just be chosen, for the most part, by Zachary Taylor. William M. Meredith, would be Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of War George Crawford, who is going to have a very long career. And one of his biographers, I think, admitted that he's probably one of the most pure individuals in this country's history. No one was purer than him. And notably, his Attorney General, Reverend E. Johnson, was this prominent lawyer and would actually defend many slaves and many people. Notably, I think he was the guy who represented Sanford in the Dred Scott case, and also protected a couple of people, notably Fitz John Porter and Mary Surratt, who were the alleged conspirators to go along with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Just little tidbits. He's also the first person who's going to be able to fill the position of the Secretary of the Interior, which he fills with a man named Thomas Ewing Sr. So Zachary Taylor gets inaugurated as president on March 4th, by the way, not March 3rd usually. March 3rd was on a Sunday. He didn't want to do it on the Day of Religion. And, Zachary Taylor and James K. Polk, they see each other because, he's seeing him off, Polk is, and they kind of, good job. And Taylor's like, thank you, thank you for finally some fucking recognition. And before we get into his presidency itself specifically, a lot of things do happen over his term, in particular, the specifics. Obviously, the first wave of the 49ers coming to California are also coming there, too. But several things happen. For instance, Hungary actually, little tidbit, tries to declare independence from Austria. I just want to point that out. I thought that was really fascinating and interesting. Notably, too, Harriet Tubman, one of the most famous Americans in this country's history, finally and successfully escapes from slavery. This is where things get interesting, is when immediately Zachary Taylor comes into the presidency itself. He has to deal with the problems of, sectionalism, and specifically, he's the one that's going to get the first crack at, and unfortunately have to deal with the immediate response of such a large acquisition of land by James K. Polk, specifically the entire western half of the country in particular. Now, the first thing that occurs very, very early on, immediately, is California. California wants to basically be a free state. This really begins in October of 1849 in his first term, that they really appeal to become a free state. But for the most part, in the very, very, very early goings of his presidency, that's the issue that's really going on, is trying to figure out what's going to happen with all these lands, specifically that are gained. What are we going to do with them? Because clearly California wants to come in as a free state in particular, and it's above and below the Missouri Compromise. So what are we going to do about it? And there's a whole bunch of other territories that are really being contested that are going to be dealing with the Missouri Compromise, and they're just hammering out all the details. Specifically, okay, is this going to be a free state? Is this not a free state? What's going on? What are we doing, fam? And of course, South Carolina, and specifically John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun comes in, and he's basically like, and specifically with California, the issue of California, if California is going to be a free state, even though it's below the Missouri Compromise, etc., then it's all null and void, and we're going to secede from the Union, And Zachary Taylor does not like that. He does not like that at all. In fact, he's basically borderline threatening military intervention if South Carolina attempts to secede from the Union again. And I think it's really interesting. A whole bunch of Whigs start coming in. Henry Clay is kind of like, look, man, can we do another compromise? We'll just do another fucking compromise. We'll figure some shit out. And basically, Zachary Taylor rubs a bunch of people the wrong way for the most part, because he's basically saying, why are we compromising? Like, if we're just going to do this and get rid of slavery, let's just get rid of slavery in a lot of ways. And that basically pissed off everybody, even some Whigs. And effectively, just like John Tyler, another Whig, the Whigs abandoned their president again. And this is very, very early on, though. And Taylor basically is, again, just an independent man. But you say what you will about Zachary Taylor, but he's steadfast in his personal beliefs for the most part. And he really maintained that, above all else, preservation of the Union was the ultimate necessity that was going to really be the one thing he's going to hold his hat on. Other than that, Zachary Taylor spends the next year or so, the rest of 1849 and the early part of 1850, really just trying to do a whole bunch of different proposals, proposing a transcontinental railroad, improvements to the army, and even raising the tariffs and changing a whole bunch of different shit for the most part. And a lot of ideas are not really, well, first and foremost, they're not really focusing on that idea, because like I said before, big issue is slavery, and specifically, the sectionalism that's really occurring within this country itself, North and South specifically. The Compromise of 1850 would really begin in a lot of ways with Zachary Taylor's presidency. Clay obviously starts the compromise, or attempts to start the compromise early in 1850, while Zachary Taylor's just trying to do the whole sectional issues and deal with trying to get a lot of his proposals off the ground for, internal improvements, I guess you could say, and tariff raising, etc. None of them really gaining any steam. Again, understand a lot of things are happening within the country itself, okay? First and foremost, two things are happening, I think, in Zachary Taylor's presidency. They really begin, and they're very, very noticeable, is Zachary Taylor continuing in a lot of ways the, I don't even say imperialistic need, but, I guess you could say the international aspect of the United States presidency for the most part that, really started with James K. Polk in a lot of ways. Notably with probably the one achievement of his presidency, the Clayton-Buller Treaty. It's a specific treaty that basically says, along with Great Britain, that they're going to keep Latin America pretty neutral for the most part in terms of building a canal, specifically across Nicaragua. Although it doesn't really get off the ground for a lot of reasons because, Panama is much thinner and much smaller, so that might be much more opportune destinations to specifically do. But neither one of them could really agree on a specific treaty, and it kind of just labored until big old TR comes around, basically like 50, 60 years later. Effectively, though, most of Zachary Taylor's issues are trying to deal with fucking Texas, because Texas is kind of going a little bit rogue at this particular point in time. There's a bit of a potential civil war erupting between New Mexico and Texas, and basically Zachary Taylor is sending Texas messages, hey, if you guys invade New Mexico, we're going to have a fucking problem, okay? Because New Mexico at this particular time is trying to gain some statehood to effectively join the Union and whatnot. And that's basically a little tidbit thing that we don't think about, which is just territory between the different states and how they're going to basically be, for the most part. We don't think about it today, but it's like, imagine if Colorado went to war with Delaware. I think that shit would be fascinating and funny in a lot of ways. That sounds terrible for me to say, but for the most part, he's dealing with most of those things in particular, specifically. Unfortunately for Zachary Taylor, his final days were coming. One spring of 1850 really started to come around. He was never a particularly healthy person, like I said before, and by spring of 1850, Zachary Taylor is about 65 years old or so, and he's no spring chicken. He's not helping himself with, drinking milk and raw fruits and doing a whole bunch of, He's just in a situation where he's not able to actually functionally be as healthy as he probably could be. And obviously the amount of stress that he's receiving, the stress that his wife is receiving too, and above all else, there's corruption within his cabinet itself. Notably, this weird Galpin affair, which it was a very fascinating a scandal for the most part. The Galpin family of Georgia, they've been paid by the U.S. government certain claims dating back all the way to like the fucking 1700s, and that the heirs of the family were supposed to be paid by or they got paid like 190 plus $1,000 in interest. It's really interesting. And the Treasury Secretary paid it and approved by the Attorney General. And basically everyone is gaining a shit ton of money. People find out about it, and everyone's like, foul, and it actually almost leads to a bit of an issue, to a point where Zachary Taylor might actually have to, either resign or be impeached or whatever you want to call it. He doesn't really live long enough for that to actually happen, though, unfortunately for him. But it's a fascinating ending in a lot of ways to the presidential aspirations and potential for Zachary Taylor. He was about to replace the three men before any issues come across where he might actually end up being impeached. Anyways, on July 4th, 1850, physically a very debilitated and stressed man Zachary Taylor was at this particular point in time. And, he's, again, not the most healthy person. He's living in Washington, D.C. Humidity is really incredible. And he eats specifically raw fruit and drinks a lot of milk and vegetables and really ice water. And unfortunately, his stomach just starts rumbling like crazy. And he's like, ooh, doctor, what's going on with me? And the doctor basically just gave him some chamomile tea and opium, which shit was wild back then, homie. And soon after, the president basically just seemed a little bit better the next couple days, and he seemed to feel a little bit chill, a little vibing with himself, although he's probably numbed by the opium. Unfortunately, soon after, for Zachary Taylor, his health would just continue to deteriorate left and right. And some of the doctors come back that are basically just like, it's nothing's working. They think it's cholera morbus, and they monitored him in the best way that they possibly could, even though he was constantly dehydrated, which only made things exacerbated and much, much worse. Zachary Taylor, some of his last words, I believe, was, "I'm about to die. I expect the summons very soon. I've tried to discharge my duties faithfully. I regret nothing, but I am sorry that I'm about to leave my friends." And then he dies, literally just several hours later, unfortunately, after hearing these words. And the First Lady, Margaret, she was so broken immensely. She would soon pass too. She could not. What she's known as is a semi-invalid, because her daughter Mary is the one that actually ends up becoming the hostess for a lot of the White House events. And Margaret was not in any condition to really be the First Lady. And specifically, she was just as unhealthy as Taylor, and she would end up dying 2 years later as well, like I said before. Let's just talk about it. There's a whole bunch of different rumors about Zachary Taylor and how he died specifically. There's a whole bunch of different potential historical reputations about how he died specifically. And actually a couple rumors that he actually probably was poisoned by arsenic, and in fact, it appears that there was arsenic during some DNA evidence that they had actually conducted on Zachary Taylor in his system, but potentially speaking, not enough to actually commit any sort of form of death. So it seems like cholera was actually the opportune actual cause of Zachary Taylor's death, unfortunately. But Zachary Taylor, long gone, and basically dies. His death is on July 9th, specifically 1850, at the age of 65 years old. What is the legacy of Zachary Taylor? Honestly, I really don't know. That sounds kind of obvious, to be quite honest with you, because Zachary Taylor's just this one president who he doesn't even get a chance to really show his stuff for the most part, and I think he's always going to have this weird historical legacy as one that he was never really made for president. He didn't appear presidential, it didn't appear to do the yada yada yada, and it doesn't help that he only had about a year and some change, basically just a year to just be president for the most part. He didn't really get anything done. He couldn't really do anything or accomplish anything, although in fairness he tried. And I think he tried to be his own man, so I can respect that in many ways and aspects. I mean, he's a fascinating war hero, through and through. And I think he's one that I think learned, because in his early goings, he's not the most tactful military genius by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, he gets a lot of men killed early in his career. And I think he really learns that, so that by the time the Mexican-American War really occurs, he's got everything set up. He's got his men. He's trying to be as well fortified as possible. He's basically just trying to get as much supplies that he can. Preparedness is the key word for Zachary Taylor. And he's going to show undeniable loyalty, capability. I mean, there's a reason why he's called Rough and Ready, because he's with his men through it all, through and through. It's very admirable, And with Zachary Taylor, it makes me question, I think in a lot of ways, for better or worse, the motives of political parties and political machines, for the most part, to really just try and get power, It's not saying that Zachary Taylor is a horrible candidate by any stretch of the imagination, but, by all accounts, it makes you question some of the motives that a lot of these political figures and a lot of these political groups are really just putting these people up just to get power and win power. And it's very apparent in this election. It's nothing against Zachary Taylor, like I said before, but, I mean, you're trying to argue sectionalism, or you're just basically putting this guy up there because he's this great war hero, even though he himself is a slave owner, and it's kind of indifferent, although he will protect the Union at all costs. So I think that's very clear and very apparent with Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor is always going to be a what if for me. I don't know enough about him. I don't know enough about everything that he's done. For the most part, his entire life seems, aside from several skirmishes in various different wars and conflicts, to be pretty boring. For the most part, he just seems like a normal dude who, in a lot of ways, really lucked into the presidency. Not because he wasn't capable of being a president, but for the most part, he was never one that was going to actually try to be president. Everything points to him just being a normal dude, wanting to get money, and just wanting to be, a military leader. George Washington, people like him, Andrew Jackson, guys like that really show and really influenced a lot of young people back then to be this grandiose victor of battles left and right and whatnot. They wanted to be revered in that particular way, really above all else, than basically be president, He'd rather die in battle, I think, and rather gain the reputation or as a fierce fighter than actually, be the executive branch leader. Would he have carried that same level of capability and enthusiasm to the presidency? I don't know. I don't play with history as what ifs. You really can't. It's not fair. It's not accurate, and you really just don't know. That's just the truth, and it's just difficult to really make in that way. It's just really difficult to make an assessment on Zachary Taylor because, like I said, we don't know. Life is very fascinating. It's really interesting, and I think Zachary Taylor's someone who is just a normal dude. He really is just a normal dude, normal frontier man who basically just is this lucky war hero who kind of got to meet a whole bunch of different people in a small country at that particular point in time, and really ended up basically just being a very atypical person who ends up, or apolitical person who ends up just getting the opportunity of a lifetime in the Mexican-American War to basically just shoot himself up to be this presidential candidate, I think it's fascinating. And I think Zachary Taylor shows that really anyone in a lot of ways can just be president. There's nothing against him. I think he's a fine person, if I'm going to be honest with you. And one that, I tend to have a little more respect for when you really do even just the barest bones research, like anyone that's just like money competent, I think is someone that's good. I mean, like, it's great in my personal view. It's one of those things where, at least for me, it's like, if you're going to be president of the United States and try and run the economy and stuff and, facilitate all that stuff, you should probably have your finances in order, fam. You know what I'm saying? And, by all accounts, he at least checks that box for the most part. But Zachary Taylor, was he a good person? Was he a bad person? That's your own interpretation. I tend to look at Zachary Taylor a little more, at least in my view, a little more honestly, and I tend to think he's a much good person, a much better person than not. But he is one undoubtedly that will always do duty before his own well-being at times, it seems like, and it's respectful. He's always country first, union first, above all else. I guess if I could leave you on one specific note on Zachary Taylor, it would probably be this. Some of you might listen to this and think, why did he do this? Why did he just do his military career, et cetera, instead of thinking about his family and doing what was right? Just taking care of his family. And I tend to think in that similar vein too. But then I also think to myself, if I found something that I really wanted to do, that I found my dream job, my dream career, that, even at a very young age, he knew I wanted to be a part of the military. I wanted to do this. I wanted to do that. If you knew that you could do it and you do anything that you possibly could to do it, would you do it? I figure even back then, we would obviously say that now. Obviously we would, but back then, even then, he would say yes. And then he had all the ability and capabilities to really do so. He was going to be supported by his family, etc., etc. Life for Zachary Taylor was always about following his dreams. And when he was going to get the opportunity to follow his dreams, he followed them through thick and thin. And along the way, he ended up getting married and having a bunch of kids. And above all else, and I think he was pretty fair to his wife, in fairness too, but Zachary Taylor is one that, to me, people question sometimes why he kept doing it, why he kept going to the whole recruitment phase and doing things that kind of made him miserable. And sometimes you just do something. And I think sometimes when you actually find that job, find that career, find what you want to do for the rest of your life, it's really, really something to actually get an opportunity to achieve that. He leaves when he's 63, which back then, he might as well be in his, mid-70s at that point, late 70s, in terms of age, in terms of you surviving into later old age and adulthood. He did it. It was like a drug. And above all else, for at least Zachary Taylor, despite whatever people might think, I can't fret or be antagonistic to a man who found what he wanted to do for the rest of his life. And you know what? He's one of the very few that decided to follow his dreams. And I can't be mad at a man who did that. Anyways, thank you guys for listening, and hope you guys tune in for the next episode.